Okay, everyone, thanks for your patience. We're just waiting for one more member to join us. Well, Mike, are we missing anyone else from MVPD?
No, we're not. Acting Sergeant Kearns is here and I'm here. So we're
okay. You are complete. Okay. So we're just waiting for Member Brodowski. And let's give her one more minute and then we can get started. And there she is. There she is. Okay. Hi, Joan. I know you're coming between meetings, so thank you for joining us back to back.
Yes.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to call this meeting to order. This meeting will be conducted in accordance with State of California Executive Order N-29-20, dated March 17, 2020, and State of California Executive Order N-08-21. All members of the Public Safety Advisory Board are participating in this meeting by video conference with no physical meeting location. Members of the public wishing to observe the meeting live may do so on YouTube at mountainview.gov/YouTube or through this Zoom webinar. As noted on the meeting agenda, members of the public may provide oral public comments online during the public comment period for an item through this webinar or by phone by dialing 669-900-9128 and entering webinar ID 942-2224-4054. Any emails received by 4:30 p.m. today were forwarded to the PSAB. Emails received after 4:30 p.m. will not be read during the meeting, but will be entered into the record for the meeting. Okay, thank you. The second agenda item is a roll call. Mr. Gaines, could you take the roll, please?
Sure. Chair Iyer.
Present.
Vice Chair Frink.
Present.
Member Brodowski.
Present.
Member Langton. Member Langton. On mute.
Present.
Member Sandhu.
Present.
Member Tang.
Present.
Member Wang.
Present.
Everyone is here.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to item 3 now, which is oral communications from the public. This portion of the meeting is reserved for persons wishing to address the subcommittee on any matter not on the agenda. Speakers are allowed to speak on any topic for up to 3 minutes during this section. State law prohibits the PSAB from acting on non-agendized items. Would any member of the public like to provide comment on an item that is not on the agenda? If so, please click the raise hand button in Zoom or press *9 on your phone. Okay, so I'm just going to peek at the attendee list and see how many people have their hands raised. Okay. So there are 9 attendees with, let's see. Yep, I think we can afford 3 minutes per person. I'd like to start with Bruce England.
Thank you, Chair Iyer. You can hear me okay?
Sure.
2 questions. One might be more a comment than a question, but when PSAB was established by City Council, there was discussion about what the scope would be. And part of the discussion had to do with whether it would be police department related only, or also just public safety in general. So that would include the fire department, mental health crisis response, things like that. I know you haven't established your work plan yet. I like what Melvin has proposed so far. Some of us in the community have other ideas as well. I'm sure board members do as well. But we would like to see the scope, including all public safety aspects. So that's one. The second is there's discussion about speed limits in town and risk of collision and injury and fatalities and so on. There is a bill in the state Senate right now, AB 43, it's in the Transportation Committee, that will give cities better flexibility on setting speed limits. But one of the challenges that we hear from Public Works, and it's a valid one, is that if the speed limits are set too low, it creates an enforcement problem for the police department. And this is probably something that you haven't thought about as a board yet with other matters that you're thinking about, but I would like to see this explored. Bringing speed limits down below 35 miles an hour to 30 or 25 would be great, but how the enforcement would be handled is an important part of the story. Thank you.
Chair Iyer, you're on mute.
I'm sorry, I'm unmuting and it keeps muting me back. It's very strange. I apologize. I was saying thank you to Bruce, and I'd like to now recognize Tim McKenzie.
Hi, Tim McKenzie, he, him pronouns, Monte Loma resident for about 6 years now. And it wouldn't be a Zoom meeting if we didn't have people trying to speak while muted, right? That happens all the time. I've been guilty myself many times. I'd like to echo what we just heard from Bruce a little bit. I really think it would be a shame for this board, for City of Mountain View, for MVPD, if Public Safety Advisory Board became the Mountain View Police Department Public Relations Board. I think that it's really important to take a broad and expansive view of public safety. I think that I would love to see that as the workflow of the board. Personally, I think that we should look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs and use that as a framework for the public safety. But just as a specific example, a few weeks ago, there was an article in the Mountain View Voice. A body was found outside of the movie theater in the San Antonio neighborhood. I was really troubled by that. I felt a little bit more unsafe. And the police showed up, and we found out a week or so later that what happened was that someone had died by suicide. Having armed agents of the state tasked with law enforcement showing up did nothing to create an environment where someone would not choose to end their own life. That, I think, building an environment where we don't have people constantly trying to end their own life, I think is a much, much more pressing and urgent public safety need than anything else. Another thing that consistently comes up, this is a separate thread that I hope that you could think about as you consider your work plan, is that Mountain View MVPD is different from other police departments in the area, and we are special and unique. But something that is true from I learned this in MVPDX cohort 2 is that the Mountain View Police Department pays for insurance along with other police departments in the area. So if there's any issue like with the city facing a $10 million lawsuit because a police officer pulled someone out of their car in Mountain View and caused injury, that sort of thing is the insurance that it's protecting against. But we're pooled in with these other police departments that MVPD is supposedly so much better than. If we're going to be unique and we are going to set ourselves apart, I think that we should put our money where our mouth is. And instead of buying into insurance in case something goes wrong, like if a police officer in Sunnyvale shoots and kills someone on the job, or police officers in Redwood City shoot and kill a teacher having a mental health crisis, and then the city of Redwood City faces a lawsuit like is going on right now, that shouldn't be coming out of the Mountain View taxpayers' public coffers. If our police department really is so much better, I think one thing that we could do is transfer have it so that the police pension fund is the source of any lawsuits, because that would mean that the money is coming from our police department, and there is an incentive for the police officers to weed out any bad.
Through the chair, the time limit is up.
Thank you. All right. I do not at this time, let me just do one more last check, see any other public hands raised. So I believe that ends the public comment section. So we will now close the oral communications item and move to discussion action items. So on the agenda, we're going to be at section 4. 4.1 is the MVPD Research Fellow update. It is an update from the MVPD Research Fellow, Mr. Alex Stevenson. He will be presenting. Following his presentation, PSAB members will ask any questions they may have, and then we will open the door for public comment. No action will be taken related to this item. Mr. Stevenson, you may begin when you are ready.
Good evening, members of the board, some of whom I've had the privilege of meeting before and those who I've not. It is nice to meet you for the first time. May I just get a clarification as to how much time I have? From the chair.
Did you tell us how long you would need, and I'll tell you how that fits in.
So I had understood 15 minutes, but I want to be respectful of the board's time. So.
You definitely have 15 minutes.
Sounds great. And then in the classic Zoom greeting, can everyone see the slides that I have shared?
Yes, I believe we can.
Sounds great. Well, as mentioned, it's very nice to be here. My name is Alex Stevenson. I'm the research fellow within the City of Mountain View Police Department. I'm also a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. And I am here today to share with this board a little bit of an update of what we have been working on and to get some of the board's feedback and input. So this presentation is going to cover 3 areas. The first one is going to discuss why we've been taking a look at traffic stops for this initial report when considering potential sources of disparities and bias within the Mountain View Police Department. The second part is going to be a fair number of graphs, which will discuss sort of summarizing data on stops as well as searches. And then finally, I'd like to present at least very initial baseline results from one of the primary tests of discrimination. And I apologize for the typo there. Very quickly, just while this presentation is going to be a data-focused presentation, I would be loath if I didn't mention that there has also been a fair amount of qualitative field work behind this as well. And this has included interviews with the vast majority of the MVPD command staff, including the changeover. I've also been able to discuss issues with patrol officers. I've gone on about 8 hours of ride-along so far on a Friday night, which has given me at least some window into Mountain View patrol procedure, especially as it relates to traffic stops. And I've also been able to speak with many individuals in the record staff and support, all of whom are invaluable to this effort. It has been, in my experience, and it is just a N of 1, but all of my questions, the Mountain View Police Department at all levels have been happy to answer so far. And that's made this work go substantially more smoother than it might have gone otherwise. So the first question that might be a reasonable one is, why is the report and what we're working on focusing on traffic stops? And to kind of step back, part of the reason we might ask this question is there's lots of reasons to imagine that there are bias or potential disparities within police department procedure, just thinking abstractly. And traffic stops are but one way that the police interact with a community, in particular a community of motorists. So why this one? Well, the first reason is said on that slide is that traffic stops are in fact almost always officer initiated. That's true in the Mountain View data. It's about 98% of all of the traffic stops are officer initiated based on disposition codes in the administrative data. The second one, though, is a data issue. And depending on how you feel about that, you may be more or less skeptical about results, but it's important when we're considering predominantly issues of racial disparities and racial bias that we actually have consistent data on that. And in Mountain View, the primary interaction for which not only do we have consistent data on perceived race, age, and gender across time. So we have data from 2014 to 2020 that we've been looking at, is on traffic stops. That's not true for other stops necessarily, and it's also not necessarily true for the universe of cases necessarily. So we have a data advantage in looking in traffic stops. The second advantage that is also a data question, we might think broadly in terms of compliance. And I don't use compliance negatively, more that one of the requirements for a Mountain View police officer after dealing with a traffic stop is they are required to fill out a form that includes perceived race, age, and gender before they're allowed to go back into what would be sort of informally known as active service. That is, they could take calls again. And this is something that's required either if they are in a car on the desktop computer, the mobile computer within the vehicle, or if they are on a motorcycle and they don't necessarily have access to it, they can radio into the dispatch to do so. But in either case, they need to fill it out. And so that also gives us a window that we may not see, for example, in just casual contacts between, say, a police officer and a community resident, which may not necessarily be subject to the same reporting requirements. And I'd also kind of thinking generally, and I've spoken about this at least with some of you in various MVPDX forum, which was greatly helpful for me. This is administrative data, and more generally, it's observational data. And by observational data, I mean that I don't have the ability to randomly assign police officers to stop cars. And I also don't have the ability to look at every single possible car that a police officer could have stopped but chose not to. I instead have the administrative records that the police department has. And one consequence of that is there are some questions that simply cannot be answered with this data. For example, as I mentioned in the second bullet point, we're not necessarily able to compare between cities, so Mountain View versus, say, San Francisco, not just because of data limitations, but also because we can imagine that there are a whole host of unobservable factors that differentiate the San Francisco Police Department from the Mountain View Police Department. Similarly, it was one of the advantages of traffic stops is they're often always officer initiated. But one question that you may want to know about potential disparities or bias is questions about how police officers act with different neighborhoods. Here, though, we have a problem just with our data because it's observational in nature, in that the reason why a police officer may be in a certain area may be true for a host of reasons. For example, that's just a normal part of their beat. It could be that residents have previously called in and have asked for greater police presence. It could be because there is views on behalf of the officer that there may be an increased risk of crime in that area. It may be where officers frequently eat lunch and so are returning from lunch break. But all of those will mean that there is a feedback between the kind of neighborhood level and the police officer. As a consequence, that is something that if you're incredibly skeptical about data, is I would think as a researcher fair to be skeptical about. I'm a little bit more optimistic than that in that I think we can learn something, but what we learn is an implied experiment thinking about the police motorist encounter. So that's our unit of analysis. And our tests for discrimination that are looking at potential disparities or bias are considering whether or not officers would make similar choices when stopping community members, in this case, with different perceived racial or ethnic backgrounds. And so that in mind is the kind of idea and behind this data analysis, but I am needing to point out that there are many other very interesting questions that might be interesting to the community, certainly might be interesting to the police department, that this kind of effort is unable to shed light on just due to the data that we have and importantly, the data we don't have. So I'm going to, in this presentation, in part for time reasons, only focus on the third bullet point, which is referred to as the veil of darkness test in terms of the specific test that we've done for discrimination. And that's predominantly because that test is fully completed. The outcome and threshold tests are not fully completed yet. And so consequently, I'm not presenting them publicly, but I'm happy to talk if there are questions about them informally. What I would simply draw your attention to on this slide is is the difference between disparities and bias. So disparities refer to outcomes that differ by race and ethnicity, and racial disparities, this is not a surprising point, plague every aspect of American society. For example, there are strong racial disparities and ethnic disparities in home ownership in the state of California, as well as many other states, including my home state of Minnesota. The question that the police department has been very interested, the city has been very interested, I know community members have been very interested in as well, is whether or not we see evidence of bias. And this definition I adapt from a National Academy of Science report from 2018 looking at policing and racial bias. And it's referring to a difference in behavior, in this case on behalf of a police officer, that we might attribute to another person's race, i.e. a police officer treats a Black motorist differently than they would treat a white motorist, or a motorist who they perceive to be Black or perceive to be white. The most common test that is normally used for this, and we can think a little bit in terms of summary tests, are what are referred to as benchmark tests. And that's where you compare the frequency in which a group experiences stops, and you scale that for the amount of contact that you would expect. If you note in the parentheses, I've sort of labeled which of these tests I think are better at dealing with questions of disparities versus questions that are in dealing with questions of bias. And part of the reason that I tend to be skeptical of benchmark tests comes from some views in the academic literature, which talks very much about what we refer to as a denominator problem, i.e. what the scale for contact we're supposed to use is. And this is very challenging. So in the Mountain View Police Annual Report, there is in some sense an example of a benchmark test when looking at citations scaled via the census. But it's not obviously clear that we should expect for any reason the amount of contacts police have to perfectly mirror a census designation. And this is even more true perhaps for traffic stops, for which not only do we not expect all motorists that police may come across to be from Mountain View, but we also simply just do not have a good census of the motorists that would come through Mountain View on a given day. So while this is a test that we are performing, I always think of it more as a descriptive test. So to summarize the data that we have on traffic stops, again, as I mentioned, we're looking from the years 2014 to 2020. I would draw your attention to three parts of this chart in the following order. If you look at the year 2014, while on this chart would includes all traffic stops beginning in March of 2014, and that's due to a transition in the computer-aided dispatch or the record system that the Mountain View Police Department had in 2014. On this chart, we include all stops, but one of the challenges that I've been attempting to solve is that early on in that procedure, there was not extensive business logic to confirm that there wouldn't be data entry errors. And so early on in 2014, some of the data is not corrupted per se, but is not accurate. And so one of the efforts that I've been doing is trying to fix that data to make sure that the various categories line up to what they're supposed to do. For example, that someone's age isn't searched. In 2020, we also notice a huge decrease. My view that I don't think is a particularly surprising one is this is predominantly due to the effect of COVID-19 and the corresponding drastic decline in motorists within Mountain View and the surrounding area. The third overall trend, though, starting in 2016, and it's not a large one, but is that we are seeing a decrease in traffic stops from the Mountain View Police Department, from a high of around 9,500 to a little bit over 6,500 in 2019. And if we imagine that traffic is constant in Mountain View over this period of time, that would also represent kind of an absolute decrease. However, we don't have I have no information on traffic in Mountain View. And so consequently, it may be possible that traffic is decreasing over that period of time, in which case this, while you see a sloping trend, does not imply fewer traffic stops relative to the population. Here is the same chart. Here I have used the racial classifications that follow the Racial Identity and Profiling Act reporting designations. I merely note that to suggest that in several of these categories, there are sub-classifications. For example, an officer would have the opportunity, supposing they came across a motorist who they perceive to in some sense have Japanese descent, and so they perceived that person to be of Japanese ethnicity, they could enter that, and this would be aggregated in this chart to Asian American Pacific Islander. The major summary takeaway of this is the three largest aggregate racial/ethnic groups that are stopped in Mountain View are Asian American Pacific Islanders, Hispanic, Latino, Latinx individuals, and white individuals. And that changes somewhat slightly over time. White individuals and Hispanic, Latino, Latinx individuals in all years are most likely to or have the most stops in our data. And finally, when thinking about stops, it's also important, and this is true for some of the tests that we'll plan to look at for discrimination in relation to search decisions, the vast majority of stops by the Mountain View Police Department do not result in a search. In any given year, it's between about 3 and 5%. Maximum, we're looking at about 700 search stops. And so that means that we have a small amount of data. When we disaggregate what those searches can see, we find that consent searches are the most common type of search that occurs about 36% of all searches in the data. Consent searches are something that is worth considering because in many ways they are ones that allow officers to have large amounts of discretion, and they are also some that can be refused by motorists. It is the case that perceived Hispanic and white motorists make up the majority of consent searches. And without trying to minimize this finding at all, I do merely note that we are beginning to deal with very small samples. And so I'm happy to discuss in questions, because my time is running short, anything in addition to this. But it does mean that some of our search questions, so our outcome tests and our threshold tests, may be highly sensitive to very small samples. The last test I want to present, or in some sense the first test of discrimination, is what's referred to as a veil of darkness test. And again, if there are further questions, to not go over my time, I'm happy to speak in much greater detail for any questions the board has. But a basic way to understand this is a veil of darkness test is imagining an experiment for which we move daylight savings time around. And so similar to our search question, we have a much smaller pool of data than the total number of traffic stops. And what we read from this chart is that all three of these confidence intervals, which are comparing the relative rates, for example, of Asian American Pacific Islander motorists to white motorists, Black motorists to white motorists, and Hispanic motorists to white motorists, include 0, which means we don't have any statistically significant evidence to suggest that coefficient is different between the two. And an implication of that is our baseline veil of darkness tests do not provide evidence of bias, given the data we have so far. I'll merely note very quickly in finishing up, and thank you for listening to the board's time, that there are a few more things to go before we achieve a final report, most notably finish implementing the threshold test for MVPD data, which is a test that looks for disparities and bias in the sort of search probability as well as the hit rate, which says how often an officer finds contraband conditioned on a search. There's also further completing inventory of data sanitization checks. Again, as I mentioned, there are some data errors, and correcting those could potentially change our results, especially as we deal with questions with very small amounts of data. And finally, further validate and complete robustness checks that are common in the academic literature. So for example, the veil of darkness test that I presented to you does not have a robustness check to check, for example, the day of the week, and that may alter those coefficients. And doing all of those is both good practice, but also is the most likely way to get the best answers for these questions. And so with that, I thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to open up for any questions the board may have.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Stevenson. We are now going to take questions from PSAB members. I'm going to go ahead and give myself the opportunity to ask the first question. I'm wondering, Mr. Stevenson, if you could go back to that very almost last slide you presented, this one right there. Could you walk us through that again very slowly? Because
yes, absolutely.
I did not. I appreciate the conclusion does not provide evidence of bias, but I'm not sure why.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you could walk us through that.
Yes, very happy to. And again, I apologize for being a little bit off on time to not be able to do that during the presentation.
No, this is important. No worries.
So the way that we think of a veil of darkness test is we can imagine what we would say is a natural experiment. And the natural experiment goes as follows. One thing that we may be worried about when police officers stop a vehicle is that they are stopping a vehicle based on the race of the motorist. So that, for example, they're more likely to stop a black motorist than a white motorist. So we could imagine, well, how could we test that? And a natural experiment we might do is keep everything the same, except vary the amount of light in the world. And I can attest that when it's very dark outside, you cannot see the race of a motorist. So the natural experiment uses daylight savings time to do that. And so conditioned on assumption that, for example, at March at 7 p.m., the same people are on the road, or the same population, as would be true in November of 2017, so daylight savings time changing over time. We compare the amount of stops when it is dark versus when it is light. If this coefficient, and so if you look at those kinds of dots in the very middle of these lines, if those coefficients were below 0, and we'll ignore the bars for a second and just talk about the point estimate, that if the estimates were below 0, what that would say is that, in this case, focusing on the comparison between black motorists and white motorists, so the bar in the middle, what that would say is that black motorists are less likely to be stopped after dark. And that would be evidence, given that everything else is the same, except for the fact now it's dark outside, that police officers may be utilizing race in their decision to stop individuals. Because when they can't see who is behind the wheel of a car, in this case, black motorists are stopped less often. That's what you would look for in this test if you were looking to see potential evidence of bias against a minority group. In this case, all 3 of our bars have that point estimate, so that circle, above 0. And so the initial implication of that, if you wanted to say that actually all of these 3 groups relative to white motorists are more likely to be stopped when it is dark outside in this narrow window. Again, we're only focusing on daylight savings time. So we can't say anything about 10 o'clock in the morning or 2 a.m. when it's always light or always dark outside. So that's what the implication is. But then to go back to those bars, and again, I'll direct your attention to the middle comparison between black motorists and white motorists. We see that that was what we would describe as a confidence interval for this, which indicates, suppose we did this infinitely many times, how often the true parameter would be contained in that interval, 95% of that infinitely repeated procedure. What we see is, if you look at the dashed horizontal line, which is representing 0, that we are unable to reject that 0 is not included as the potential true parameter. And so the way to read this chart, now to go to the title implication, is that the baseline test does not provide any evidence of bias, in the sense that we don't see that point estimate below 0 and that interval not including 0. But this is also true the other way as well. The fact that these point estimates are above 0, given the very wide intervals, also doesn't give us evidence to say, for example, that white motorists are being discriminated against by the Mountain View Police Department. And it is a fair interpretation as well, as I mentioned, in the same way that we have a small sample in relation to our search decisions, that here, because we're slicing our data during periods of daylight savings, one thing that we may say is that there aren't simply enough stops during that period to give us a very precise estimate. And precise in this context would mean that those intervals were very close together. And here they're kind of wide. I don't have a view as a researcher on that, but perhaps as a community member in Mountain View, the fact that the Mountain View Police Department has not stopped enough people during this period of time may be considered a benefit. But in terms of research, it would make it a little bit harder to give a very precise estimate.
Thank you for walking us through that. I'd like to open it up to PSAB members for questions. Derek, you have your hand raised.
So my question is this data adjusted for representation of the population of the group in the community? And do you know if the police officer potentially has run the person before they stopped them and made a decision on pulling them over based on already having their record?
Thank you for the two questions. Just to clarify, in terms of the second question, do you mean that a police officer, for example, sees someone they believe to be speeding and follows them for a while to run a license plate number?
Yes. And then they get the owner information and they kind of follow through and run the owner operator.
Right. So in regards to the first question, the data that comes from the police department is not adjusted. One of the things that I have done that is not being presented here is run, in essence, that benchmark test. I've been also looking for other benchmarks to, in essence, adjust based on the composite, and that's why they're not being presented here. It does seem, looking at the raw numbers, so what you're seeing in terms of summary statistics, for example, this chart here, these are raw numbers. So in raw terms, for example, in 2019, Hispanic, Latino, and Latinx folks were the largest group that were in this data that had been pulled over, but that's not adjusted. In terms of the second question, my understanding, at least my personal observations in terms of ride-alongs, is that those kinds of things did seem to happen, that you would see a police officer run a license plate. One reason why I've used the phrase perceived race of the driver is, at least in the state of California, there is no ground truth for race, but you may be able to access things such as if there was potential priors, the age, the information that comes from the driver's license. That won't be contained in the sense that this data does not have a field for which an officer says, yes, I ran the plate ahead of time, or no, I did not.
Well,
Does that fully answer your questions?
And yeah, the other thing was, as far as percentage of the populations, does the Mountain View obviously has a large white, Hispanic, and Asian population. Were those graphs account for that difference in the representation of the population?
So these are raw counts. In terms of the community, if you adjust, you will get some differences. So in particular, groups that are less than 50% of the population will be upweighted. So you'd see relative, their numbers would go up. It's not, the reason why I haven't specifically shown that chart is, as I mentioned, I've been trying to find potentially other benchmarks, but the real benchmark we'd like to know is not necessarily the population breakdown of Mountain View particularly, but the breakdown of motorists. And that is likely to, as I said, include members who don't live in Mountain View, but also we might see drastically different driving patterns. So for example, perhaps just to pick a representation on this chart, perhaps perceived Middle Eastern drivers make up a very small percentage of the total driving community in Mountain View, and yet seem to be stopped substantially higher. We don't yet have good information on that. And so that's what I've been trying to locate. I hope that answers your question.
Yep, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to call on Member Tang.
Hi, thanks, thanks, Mr. Stevenson, for your presentation today. I had a couple clarifying questions. One is, so I believe that this veil of darkness test, is it the same time interval for the time of day for both like March and November, like the same hour?
Yes, it's particularly looking at sort of the intertwilight period of time, and that's going to change during the year. And part of that is what we attempt to therefore use as variation, because we get variation in light throughout the year, which makes it easier or more difficult in order to be able to see. So that's the underlying premise of the test. One assumption that's embedded in that is that the only thing that would be changing during the year is light. So for example, these tests would not be, and this is true, a common limitation of any sort of observational test for discrimination, if say the underlying population drastically changed. So for example, in March, suppose there were only Black motorists, white motorists, and Hispanic motorists on the road in Mountain View. So there were no Asian American Pacific Islander motorists. It's obviously an absurd example, but just for a thought experiment purpose, if they weren't there in March, but they were there in November, the underlying distribution has changed. But the way the veil of darkness test is inclined to work is we're trying to use the variation in light to replicate, in some sense, the experiment. What if you made it more difficult for officers to see who was behind the wheel of a car?
So we're basically trying to control for things like who was on shift, who is on the road, and basically we're only looking at amount of light is the objective of this test.
Yeah, if we thought about it like a medical experiment, so like blue pill, red pill, the amount of light would be, a lot of light is the blue pill and no light is the red pill. And what one of the things in terms of robustness checks that I would like to continue to do, as I said, this is baseline. You're raising a lot of great robustness checks that I'm hoping to be able to get information on. For example, are the same people on shift during same periods, or do they change a lot? Do we think that officers, do different things at different times of the year? Those would all be reasons for which maybe these change as a result of that. And so that's why it's important to do these robustness checks. So I present this as a baseline because the baseline is finished, but with the limitations, as I mentioned, both in terms of needing to do more robustness checks, as well as illustrating, we're dealing with a sort of small window of time. We're dealing with that intertwilight period. So this would not be able to speak, for example, to someone's experience of potential discrimination at 10:30 in the morning, for which light would not be a concern.
Thank you. And so I'm also assuming that the years that you put up in total traffic stops are the years of data that you analyzed for this veil of darkness test?
That is correct.
Okay. Thanks for answering my questions.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Cal, you have your hand raised. Member Sandhu?
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Mr. Stevenson. I have a few questions I'll go through quite quickly. I was hoping everyone would have asked them, but nevertheless, you said 98% of traffic stops were by MVPD officers. Who were the other 2%?
I apologize if I misspoke. I meant that they're officer initiated. The vast majority of traffic stops are initiated by a Mountain View police officer, as opposed to a community member has called 911 and said, okay, someone drove 100 miles past my house, and so there is a response from a police officer.
Okay, actually,
happen in the data and are coded as such. They are still traffic stops, and so they're in this data as traffic stops, and they're included in these tests. But this is only analyzing, to be very clear to the board as well, this is only looking at stops conducted by the Mountain View Police Department.
Okay, the next one I want to ask is, which neighborhoods are most traffic stops initiated? I know we have major thoroughfares like Shoreline, El Camino, and Ringstuff, but in neighborhoods wise, which neighborhoods do we have the most stops?
I don't want to speak to that specifically because I can't guarantee that I have the perfect answer for you, but I will follow up and send written to the board what that number is. Generally speaking and informally speaking, most traffic stops occur at the primary traffic choke points within Mountain View, so predominantly on the main roads and close to highways.
And all right, that's fair. And the percentage of Mountain View residents who are cited?
I guess I apologize. I'm not totally sure if I understand your question. As in what?
You give us numbers. You showed the graphs of different years and how many traffic stops. Out of those, because a lot of people travel here to work, right? Not in 2020, obviously. So what's the percentage of Mountain View residents who were cited?
So the data I have looked at has been, at least the stuff, the work I've done so far has been agnostic to the question of percentage of residents. I believe it would be possible to link the information in terms of citations, and I will do so as soon as possible and send the board the answer to that question.
And thank you. And the last question, basically, I don't know whether you can, maybe it should be directed to the police department. So the citations create a source of revenue, right, for the police department and the city. What's the amount of revenue? Would you know by any chance? If you don't, it's fair enough. We can try to find that information.
That is not information that I am aware of. I think that would be a question better posed to the police department.
All right. No worries. Thank you very
Thank
much
you.
indeed. Thank you.
I apologize I could not be more helpful at this
No,
juncture.
no,
but I
no
will
apology
get those
needed. Thank
information
you.
for you.
It's very helpful what you've said so far.
Okay, Member Tang, is your hand up again? Or is it still left up? Okay, please go ahead.
Sorry, I just had one more question out of curiosity, and I know it's not included in this current set of data that we're looking at. I'm just very curious as to whether the year, make, and model of a car is included in this in the data available, and I just wondering out loud if that happens to be significant. But I know it's not the data that we're looking at. Just posing a question out loud.
I'm happy to answer the specific. The data I have access to, especially, for example, warning. So for any data for which there wouldn't be extensive reports, I will not have data on make, model, et cetera. And I don't want to wander aloud too much, but in a very, very limited sense, we might imagine that one potential worry or threat to our inference about discrimination is if officers, and we're thinking generally, so I want to be very clear that I'm not speaking to any specific research that I have done or saying anything about the Mountain View Police Department specifically, but we might think in general that if individuals correlate certain kinds of vehicles with certain kinds, for example, certain racial or ethnic groups, or at least perceived racial or ethnic groups, they could use that as a proxy in such a way. And this is often one of the questions that's related to a limitation of the veil of darkness test, which is there isn't a way to tease out necessarily in that test, are officers, for example, substituting some other information that they are able to see during both the day and the night as a proxy. And so that certainly could be occurring. That's not something that the data I have access to would be able to speak to, and I think is a generally difficult inference problem. And this is something that's difficult for thinking about not just policing, but any kind of questions of disparities, which is, what information are people using when they make decisions? And we don't have access to all of that. It would be great if we did. I would love that. Thank you for your question. I hope I answered it.
Vice Chair Frink, you have your hand raised.
Yes, ma'am. I also have two questions. Do we capture the data regarding the actual infraction that motivated the stop? And second, was the infraction that motivated the stop the only infraction that was cited during the stop? Do we have that information?
To my knowledge, for all stops for which we'll have sort of disposition, so it'll be the reason for a stop, that will sometimes include multiple dispositions. So for example, there is, say, a vehicle stop because there is a broken taillight, and also there is, say, a parole violation. And so it's known that that car is driven by someone who is wanted for a parole violation. In the data, my understanding is that both of those will be included in a row. So yes, sorry, apologies. The other, the capturing the actual infraction, certainly I believe for all citations that will be true. I would have to look at the data, and I'm happy to follow up as to whether it also applies for warnings. But I believe in all cases, the sort of initial reason for a stop is included. And that is particularly going to be true whenever there's a search question. That information we should have. Indeed, it was one of the early signs when I was cleaning the data to suggest, oh, we might have some data challenges. And it was something that was also brought up to the record staff, and that the reason for stop would be, say, 20. And that's because the age had moved incorrectly.
Okay. Right. All right. Member Langton, I see your hand up.
Just one more. I'm kind of making an assumption here, but basically, like equipment violations, tail lights, and so forth. They tend to be on older cars. I mean, my car has LED lights. It's going to last forever. And I think that skews to a poorer demographic. Do you touch on any of that? Do you have data on that? Will you?
It is something that I'm looking at. I agree with you. Member Tang, I think, and I don't want to speak for the member, I think was suggesting a kind of similar thing and asking, make, model, and car, that we may imagine that cars are also driven, as you say, older cars might be driven by lower socioeconomic status individuals. So I don't have, to my knowledge, in the data, certainly for warnings, for example, anything about specific make, model, and cars. But I think it's an excellent topic to dive in more deeply, and we'll certainly do so. And I thank the board for the suggestion.
Okay, I have one more comment, but I'm going to wait until after public comment. Don't see any more hands raised from PSAB. So if that is the case, would any members of the public like to make comments on this item? I'm going to take a peek at how many people have their hands raised. Looks like 2. So I think that will enable us to have 3 minutes per speaker. I'm going to start with Tim McKenzie.
Hi all. Thank you very much for the presentation, Alex. That was instructive. I learned a lot. And I'm just, if I understand correctly, it's sort of at the officer motorist interaction, because that's the level of the data and where we can actually get statistically significant relevant analysis out of it. And so I sort of have 2 questions about that. One is, does that mean if we disaggregated, we could see, just speaking hypothetically, if there was one bad apple and then a department full of amazing police officers, would looking at the individual data, since it's at the motorist officer level, would that come out? And then secondly, sort of just a comment, like, as a citizen of Mountain View, I'm sort of a citizen of the Bay, going between the different cities really is the borders are a little bit artificial in a way. It's like going from one to the other doesn't feel like a huge difference. So even if things are like, how can we, is there any data for other cities in a similar way then that we could maybe start getting in comparison? Because from the operational standpoint of a person going through, we would like to be able to compare and know, like, hey, maybe I should avoid that city, even though I understand that the current data as it exists doesn't allow that. Is that something that could happen? Thank you very much. It was very instructive, and I look forward to seeing the rest of the analysis as it plays out.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Miriam, please go ahead.
There we go. I'm unmuted now. This will not take 3 minutes. Thank you so much for this analysis. One thing that I think is very cool is the amount of data cleaning that's happened here that makes this data something that we can do analysis on. And I think it would be cool, and I don't know what the legal ramifications of this are, if it could be released to the public or made open source, if your analysis can be made open source in some way, because there's a lot of data geeks here in Mountain View in the Bay Area, and I'm sure that that people would like to be able to take a look at it. And then also it might set a standard for other cities where right now we don't have data to compare, but if we said, well, in Mountain View, we do have this public data set, it might encourage other cities to do the same. Thanks.
Thank you. I do not see any other hands raised at the moment from the public, so I'd like to return to the PSAB group and see if there are any other hands raised from members of PSAB with questions. Cleve, is your hand raised again, or is it left over?
It is raised.
It is raised. Please go ahead.
Yeah, just one other question, and you may have covered this already, but are the days of the weeks covered in the data?
Yes. So just as an example of a row in this data, it would start with, in essence, a unique identifier, and you can split that out, and that identifier is the day as well as the time. So I have converted those days, for example, today, Thursday, June 24th, if that were a row, now there is a variable in my data set that would say Thursday. And that will be helpful for any kind of questions where we may expect the days of the week to be different. And I think there's good reason to imagine that weekend traffic will look different than weekday traffic, for example.
And evening traffic as well?
Yeah, because we have time, so we can look at evening traffic. The veil of darkness analysis that was presented is taking advantage of the fact that we have those times to look in the evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other PSAP hands raised? I don't see any, so I will go ahead with I have 2 points to make. One is I've made some notes of questions that either Mr. Stevenson, you said you would follow up on, or I'm not quite sure if the answer can happen or not. We don't need to go, I'm going to just read them out. What I'd like to do is note them as follow-up items. So either the answer is it can't happen, or you bring us back something. So specifically, which neighborhoods? And I'm going to say this is the referring to veil of darkness, but assume for all the tests that you're going to be investigating, these same questions will likely come up. Which neighborhoods? The number of stops that were residents versus commuters, and how that rate reflects back on the actual population of Mountain View. The amount of revenue that's generated by traffic stops over the period of time that you are tracking. The initial reason that a traffic stop happens. The make and model of the cars that are being stopped. Individual officer data. So are there officers that are making more traffic stops than others? And I'm guessing that by it itself will engender more questions, but I'm just going to stop there. Whether you will be looking at data from other similarly sized cities in the Bay Area or elsewhere to compare. And I guess with this similar demographic makeup, and whether your analysis will somehow, for all the data geeks out there, will be made open source. I do think Mountain View is a very innovative city, and we lead often by example. And I think at the end of this, that would be something for us to consider. Okay, so those are all the questions I heard that I'm not sure of the answers for, so I'm going to lob them over to you, Mr. Stevenson. And I'd like to ask, tell us the timeline that you're working on right now for these other tests that you're doing, or data that you're analyzing, and when can we next expect an update from you?
Hey, Kavita, if I could, before you get that answer, I think the neighborhood question, unless I understand it wrong, they patrol in sectors. So
It might be more of a sector question.
Exactly. That was my point. The other thing is, I think, and again, I might be wrong here. There are some folks who just do traffic, and then there are other folks who do other things. So that group of people may have an outside number of data.
Exactly. The chances are the traffic officers are going to have the predominant number of traffic stops. Yeah. So the individual officer data, I'm going to lob that over to you with a big fat grain of salt, right? Like, you tell me if there's anything to be gleaned from that information with exactly the types of things that the vice chair just mentioned. Right. So maybe it's, yeah, I'm not going to suggest anything. You tell me. Vice Chair Frink, do you have anything else that you'd like to add at this point?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Actually, before I go on to your timeline, Member Sandhu, did you have a comment? Oh, did Member Sandhu disappear?
No, I'm right here.
There you are. There you are. You slipped off my screen.
I'm
there
not
you
that invincible. Thank you very much.
Please go ahead.
I just wanted to add one more thing to your list.
Okay.
How many, due to the traffic stops, how many resulted in arrests? You don't have to give me a breakdown of the arrest, but could be DUIs, violent, they were wanted, but just a percentage. That's all. If you could find that out, that'd be very, very helpful. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments on my list? Any other to-dos to put on Mr. Stevenson's list? Okay. So Mr. Stevenson, when can we expect you back? How would you like to interact with us? Do you have some thoughts on that?
Madam Chair, I just wasn't sure if another hand popped up on my screen, and before I'm happy to answer the question, but.
Sorry, Member Langton. My Zoom is acting up. I apologize.
Well, I was kind of on and off the fence whether I wanted to ask the question.
Don't play with us, Derek. Come on.
Did you see any? You said most of the stops were at major choke points, intersections or whatever. But you didn't see evidence of any like neighborhood bias, like in particularly like the Cal Ave area?
Thank you, member. Madam Chair, I'm happy to answer as much or as little as you would like of this list. And I know you had a question about the timeline as well.
Yeah, I'd like Member Langton, if okay with you, I'd like to put the Cal Ave question and put that in with the neighborhood/sextors question when Mr. Stevenson is in a position where he's comfortable to answer that. And Mr. Stevenson, I'd like to understand your timelines, and if in an ideal world, how would you like to keep us abreast of your progress?
Thank you, and thank you to all members of the board, as well as the community members who've spoken. These are very helpful to me to get information. I have lots of good things on the to-do list. The short answer, at least for a couple of these, is absolutely we can do breakdown by beat. That's one of. We also have lat and long and geolocations, and so questions about neighborhoods are questions that can be answered from this data. As mentioned prior, the revenue generation question is probably a question best posed for someone other than myself. For the rest of them, I will look more deeply and update the board as quickly as possible. In terms of a timeline, I'm hopeful that the initial remaining sort of base tests, or prior to robustness, will actually be done in the next week or two. And that the sort of initial draft of a final report will be done relatively soon after. I am happy within I suppose general reason, of course, to update the board on information in whatever way the board finds preferable.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, with that, I'm looking around for any more hands. All right, so with that, I think we have concluded item 4.1 on the agenda. Thank you, Mr. Stevenson, for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you to the board.
Okay, so we are now moving on to item 4.2, which is an overview of the MVPD Youth Services Unit and School Resource Officers. Principal Management Analyst Melvin Gaines and Sergeant Lloyd Kearns will present this item. Mr. Gaines, could you begin the presentation, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair Iyer. Sergeant Kearns, could you share your screen with the presentation, please?
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you. I'll just ask you to advance when I'm ready, if that's okay with you.
Yes, sir.
Chair Iyer and members of the Public Safety Advisory Board, I'm happy to present today along with Sergeant Kearns on the Youth Services Unit and specifically the School Resource Officers, providing an overview. Next slide, please. So I wanted to set the tone a little bit about why we're here. We're here because there is public interest in Mountain View Police Department's use of school resource officers. Some community members have called for the city to remove school resource officers from school campuses, and other community members have spoken in favor of the school resource officer program and would like the city to continue to provide school resource officers. The city council has ultimately decided that they'd like to have a better understanding of community concerns, as well as do their due diligence and consider potential changes to the SRO program. The City Council has discussed potentially having a study session before the end of this calendar year, end of 2021, but also would like the Public Safety Advisory Board to consider the issues and the community concerns around school resource officers prior to the City Council. So they've asked the Public Safety Advisory Board to conduct some community outreach, learn more about the community concerns, as well as to examine the school resource officer program and at some point provide their input to the City Council about the program. At last month's, our first PSAB meeting, the PSAB discussed adding this item to their work plan in order to provide input to the City Council. And today we're here to provide an overview of the SRO program in hopes that we're providing the PSAB with enough foundational information to gain an understanding of the SRO program and to decide areas that they'd like to further explore in order to provide input. And with that, I'd like Sergeant Kearns to take over and to begin presenting on the SRO program.
Good evening, board members, community members. I'd like to invite you to an evening with an SRO, or I'd say 15 or 20 minutes with an SRO. Tonight, I want to talk a little bit about, I understand the board members have received the staff report regarding the issues I'm going to be talking about tonight. And so this is really just a brief overview of that staff report that you have. I'm going to start tonight by introducing myself, who I am and my experiences. And then I'm going to go into a little bit of history of the SRO. And then we're going to talk about a day in the life of the SRO. And then at the end, we're going to just hit on a few of our major programs that we run in our youth services unit. So a little bit about myself. My name is Lloyd Kearns. I've been a police officer for working on almost 25 years now. Born in the city of San Francisco, raised in the city of Vallejo. Graduated in the city of Fairfield. I am a child of three, the eldest of those three, and we were raised by a single mom. That's significant because for a single mom to raise four boys is almost impossible, but she had a source that she depended on every day, 4 or 5 days a week, and that was my church. 4 or 5 days a week, me and my brothers attended church, and that was the foundation of why I love what I do with youth. From as early as I can remember, as 5 years old till I was 26 years old when I became a cop, I've been involved in the church. And then I took a really interest in youth. Call it a calling, I don't know. Calling a liking, I don't know. I'm a spiritual guy, so I like to call it a calling. The Lord blesses us with different abilities to do things. And I believe in a humble way that his calling for me was to mentor, work with youth. And I've been doing it since those young days in church, and then into my career as a police officer. Some of you may have heard this before, but I thought I was going to be a youth minister. I just ate and breathed church and working with kids. And I thought, okay, I'm going to be a youth minister. Here it comes. And then that didn't work out because I wanted to have a family and I figured out what youth ministers make. And that wasn't going to happen in California, in the Bay Area. So I looked into this whole thing about being a police officer and what did that mean? And if you know a little bit about my history, me being a police officer, no. I was taught at a young age, growing up in a predominantly African-American city in that time, that you don't communicate with the police. You respect the police, but you don't volunteer anything to the police. And that kind of worked about, and I'm thinking about being a police officer. No, that's not going to happen. And then, doors opened up. And 1997, I got sworn in as a police officer with the Mountain View Police Department. And this is where I am today. And year 25 starts in January of 2022. But it's been a storied career. And I have to tell you, the most exciting part of what I do, the things that when I'm done after my 25 years of what my experiences are as a police officer and what kind of changes I've made, has to do with kids, youth, mentoring, and being there as a resource and talking to kids and helping them grow into the young minds and the young people of our future. So that's me, that's my love, that's what I do. And I've been privileged to be able to do that towards the end of my career, which unfortunately for me, but great for my family, will end sometime this year. But, and so that's a little bit about me. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about my influences as a school resource officer as we go kind of through this timeline. I will keep it to that 20 minutes. So let's talk a little about, now that we heard about me, let's talk a little bit about the history of the SRO. In the 1960s, the city of Mountain View was experiencing a lot of burglaries. These burglaries were perpetrated by youth offenders. And so the department, in order to deal with that, decided that, okay, we need a special kind of officer to deal with these youth offenders that's breaking in and burglarizing places. So they created what's called a diversion officer, juvenile diversion officer. That juvenile diversion officer was tasked with figuring out what is going on. Why are these kids and are so involved in crime? And so they did the best they can to try to curb it. And then they realized, you know what? This is not working. We need preventative measures. And so as the 70s rolled in, my mentor, the great and late Bill Crawford, became a juvenile diversion officer, and he was very, very involved in what we call school resource officers today. So Bill became that diversion officer to go in and to help kids and to figure out what the problem was. And they figured out very quickly that, you know what, we need to partner with the schools. We need to figure out what is the issue? What's going on? Why are kids running the street? Why are they out and about? Why are they breaking into homes, into cars? And Bill started the school resource officer because he entered the schools to figure out what services could he offer to these kids. Now, a little bit about Bill. Bill was a unique guy, and I am honored that this guy trained me. So I took over for Bill as a school resource officer for the high school back in 2002. Bill created programs. Some of the programs I'm going to talk about a little bit later, Bill's name is all over it. He established these programs. He created these programs. Bill was the kind of guy that, I don't know if any of the board members are familiar with restorative justice. That happened way back. You know, we're talking about 20 years ago, but Bill was very crucial to restorative justice, because what Bill did is he said, you know what, this is not working. We need to get into the school, into the neighborhoods, and mentor these kids and figure out what's going on and provide some type of resource to them. So what Bill would do is Bill would show up at these kids' hearings, whether they be in juvenile court or the probation department, and he would show up and say, Your Honor, if you divert this sentencing of this kid, I will take on the responsibility of this kid. Give him to me, even though these are not his children, but he said, give him to me. Let me figure this out. And I remember when I first came on, we'd be at the community center. I show up, Bill said, you came into work? I said, yes, sir. Okay, there's a group of kids over there. We need to manage them. We're getting buses clean. We're cleaning up the park, all these different kind of things. And these type of things is that Bill did is what taught me, along with my past in youth in the church, of how to be a great school resource officer. It's not about, play yards or schools to prisons. It's about how do we get in here and how do we make a difference in these kids' lives, even though we have our own kids at home. So Bill was very instrumental in what I do to today for the last 24, almost 25 years in my service to youth. And so without this guy, I mean, I could go on all night about Bill, but I know we got 20 minutes. So what we're going to do now is the 80s came on. And then so the school diversion officer went from a juvenile diversion officer to the school resource officers. It was created by Bill Crawford. And then what you have now today in my unit, which I supervise, is we have 3 school resource officers, we have a coordinator, and we have a sergeant. Today, I am the acting sergeant of that unit, and our work is daily. We work in the 16 schools, both private and public in the city of Mountain View. It doesn't matter if your school is run off of public money or private money. If you are a youth in the city of Mountain View, we are here to serve those youth. And we work directly inside the community with kids, with youth. So my next slide, we're going to talk about the day in life of an SRO. Now, the slide I'm going to show you is you're going to see that road. Now, keep in mind that this road does not have anything to do with programs. This is what we do on a day-to-day basis. So, as you can see the moon up there, crack of dawn. My day starts at 5:30 in the morning. I'm at work, get a little workout in, because you got to stay fit in this job. You don't want kids, walking up on you and being bigger or stronger than you are. They're going to be bigger than you are, but they're not necessarily stronger. So my day starts at 5:30. I get in, get a little workout, about 45 minutes. Then I got to get to the computer. I got to see what my captain's sending me, what the sergeant's sending me, what's going on, how many reports that came in last night. In those reports, how many youth were affected by those reports, whether they be mental health calls or whether they be criminal calls or just service calls. So my staff, my team looks at those things. Then we get on the phone and we start calling and start talking to principals and we start talking to staff. Okay, I'm here today. What's going on? What's on the agenda? Between that time, a little cup of coffee here because I know what the day is looking like right now. Now that I got off the phone, now I've looked at the report. So I need to get some pick me up. So I have a little cup of coffee and then off to the patrol car. First stop, first school. As you can see, when we go to schools, most of the time, I shouldn't say most of the time, but some of the time, it's just to be there to talk and to mentor with kids. It's not necessarily a call for service, but we know the impact that we have on kids when we show up. And I know there's this big controversy about uniforms and these kind of things. And trust me, we hear it, we get it. We hear it so much that what we've decided to do in some of the cohorts that we've heard, that this big barrier between police officers and students, that we have decided to change our uniforms. So no longer will you see what some people call the military look or the police look or the aggressive look of school resource officers. We're going to polos, we're going to 511 pants, and we're talking about khaki or kangaroo type pants, because we cannot do our job if students don't want to approach us. And we're there to do a job, and that job is mentoring, teaching, educating, right? But if a kid doesn't want to come to me because that uniform is a barrier, okay, I don't need the uniform. Let's take it off. I can still do my job in a polo and some khaki pants, right? And still be able to do the job. So, but that's a different look for, there's a different response for grade schoolers because they love the uniform. So to say get rid of the uniform altogether, I don't know. That's a decision for the board and the council to make. But I would say that there is this big thing about kids at the younger age that's attracted to police officers in uniforms. Now, maybe not so much at the high school, which is why we are looking to change that appearance and that aggressiveness. Because again, if we can't go out there and be helpful, then why are we on the campus? So now I get the phone call, the first phone call. The phone call might come from Crittenden, it might come from Graham. Okay, Officer Kearns, I need you over here. We got a situation. We got some bullying going on the phones. Okay, I'm heading over in the car. I'm over to the next school. Okay, so what's going on? Principal's over here saying, okay, little Susie has been getting harassed by phone calls from another student. So we deal with that because there's a criminal aspect to that. Cyberbullying, right? Harassing. So that involves a school resource officer. Does it involve an arrest? No. It will involve the talking to the student, letting them understand, hey, this is against the law, it's bullying, it has a negative effect on children. So then I answer that call, and then I'm off. Uh-oh, phone rings again. Okay, hey, what's going on? Hey, did you remember you had a book reading today over at Bub? Yep, sure did. On my way, on my calendar. So now I'm off to Bub and I'm doing some book reading. Finished my book reading at Bub, and now we're talking about, it's probably about 11:30. So now I'm off to lunchtime. So I like to eat lunch sometimes on the campus, but the campus food's not that good. Unless you go to St. Francis. St. Francis has excellent food because, you know, they have chefs. So we like to spend our time. Sometimes we go to the police station, have our lunch. Done. Okay. Now, 30-minute lunch, phone call again. Okay, the high school just called. Hey, can you come on campus? We got some gang colors going on over here. It's the same group of kids. We just kind of want you to be a presence out here. Heading back to the high school. Okay. On the way to the high school, now school is out. It's 3 o'clock or 2 o'clock. Now, hey, Officer Kearns, we just got a complaint from the neighborhood that the kids, as they're leaving school, they're speeding down the neighborhood. And this is ridiculous. We need something done about it. So I'll take 45 minutes, 45 minutes, sit on the corner, and I do traffic control in the neighborhood. By that time, it's time to get back to the police department. Any kind of reports that I took, I got to finish those reports. Now we're talking about 3:30, 4 o'clock. It's time to go home. And then the whole cycle starts again. 4 days a week, 10 hours a day, year by year. This is what we do. Now, on top of that, there are some programs and things that we run, which I'm going to talk about next. YSU school and summer programs. We run several major programs that go year around. One of those programs is called the Mountain View Boxing, the Mountain View POW Boxing. It was started in 2008. It's really for middle school kids and high school kids. It teaches team building skills, strategy skills. Now, Mountain View Boxing, you don't have to compete in boxing. And some people say, well, isn't that violent? Well, yeah, it is. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It can be. But that's not what we're teaching. We're not teaching violence. We're teaching team building skills. We're teaching discipline. We're teaching, you know, how to do something and stick with it and better yourself. In our Mountain View Boxing program, the majority of the students that come to that program are females. I'd probably say right now, before COVID, our enlistment was about 80% females, 20% males. Okay, because these girls, they come in, they want something different. They want something that they can respond to. They want something that makes them a part of a team and accomplishment. And that's what our boxing program does. And then we have the Mountain View Explorer program. This is for ages 14 to 21 years of age. This program is about taking young kids who want to do community service in their community and yet learn about the services that's offered by their city, being in the police department. Most of the kids that run through our Explorer program never become cops, but there's a couple that do. Chief Bozell. Chief Bozell started his career as an explorer, and he found something in it. He said, I want to do my part. I want to serve. He went through the ranks, he became a chief, and then he retired. But does that happen with all of our kids? No. Some of them come for the public service of it because they need it for school. Some of them come just to learn about what we do. And it's a membership. It's a, if you really want to learn about, as a young person, about what your tax dollars is paying for in your police, then the Mountain View Explorer program is what that's about. Then we have the Dreams and Futures program. The Dreams and Futures program is our summer program, was created by that name I mentioned before, Bill Crawford. Him, Bill, and other officers created this program several decades ago. I think the Dreams and Futures program is going on 25 years, 25 to 26 years. It was created originally as a gang prevention program. It's a 2-week program that caters to 4th and 5th graders, and 6th and 7th graders. So your grade school up to your middle school. We take them over to Mountain View High School, and we go on field trips. We talk about nutrition. We do team building exercises. We do swimming. We feed them. We spend a ton of money on kids, and these programs are free to the kids. They're basically exist through donations that we get throughout the year from the community, from our from the different collaborations we have with the high schools and with Challenge Team, and even with our Kiwanis. All of these companies collaborate with us because they have a calling for working with kids and uplifting kids in our community. And so we take these kids there. As a matter of fact, Dreams and Futures start in 3 days. Monday, June 28th, we'll be out at the campus. For any of the board members who would like to come out and take a look at what we do out there with our students, we have about 50 to 55 students each session. Each session is 2 weeks long. It starts at 8:30 in the morning and ends at 4 o'clock in the evening. So we're also kind of providing like a kind of a childcare situation for parents during the summer, because they can bring their kids to our program and it's free. But I would invite anyone from the board to come out and take a look at our program. We're there Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Tuesdays and Thursdays are field trip days, and so we're not on the campus during those days. But if you want to come out on a Monday, Wednesday, or Friday between 8:30 and 4 o'clock and take a look at our program, I think you could, seeing is believing. And then we have one of our biggest programs that we run throughout the year, where we are servicing anywhere from 2,000 to 2,500 kids, is the Cops That Care program. That program was started back in 2002 by Officer Cooper. Officer Cooper was an SRO. The theme here is, if you're kind of looking at what we do here, is that we're there to create programs that enrich and enhance kids' lives. This concept of, I think it's from the schools to the prison, that's a foreign concept in the city of Mountain View. In the last 3 years, 2017, 2018, 2019, there were 6 arrests made on our campuses. 6 arrests in 3 years that had to do with juveniles. And I won't go into the specifics of those arrests because I think that's in the staff report for the board to look at. But when you look at those arrests and you look at the type of crimes that were being committed, a lot of times don't have a choice. There are county protocols that come into play, that those kids, we have to do certain things, whether it be with DV, whether it be with sex crimes and things like that. We don't have a choice. But 90% of the time, we do have a choice. We get to work with those kids, with the staff, with the school staff, and with their parents to divert them away from this so-called school to prison. At least in the city of Mountain View, 100%. Why do we love what we do? As you heard early on, I think it was a calling for me. Now, I can't speak for other SROs, but we've had some really, really good SROs. It's a 4-year assignment, but if you're really good at what you do and you are active in your unit, that 4 years can become 8 years. I'm working on my 2nd term as a school resource officer. We got an officer in the unit right now who's working on 5 or 6 years. We got an officer that just left 3 years ago who did 8 years. Because these officers believe and they buy into what we are teaching. Mentorship, education, and to get our kids to a point where they can be whatever they want and do whatever they want. And so that's going to bring me to the end of my presentation. I'd like to leave some time for questions. I am more than happy to answer all the questions. My captain is here with me tonight, Captain Canfield, and the questions that I can't answer, I'll let him answer. And so that concludes my part of it. And then I'll bring back on Mr. Gaines, and then he'll take it from there. Mr. Gaines.
Thank you for that presentation, Sergeant Kearns. Members of the PSAB, you've heard from Sergeant Kearns about the SRO program, and you also noticed a good amount of information included in the staff report. We provided information on the background of the SRO program, the staffing structure. Sergeant Kearns went in depth about what his day-to-day life as an SRO officer is. We discussed SRO programs. The staff report mentions the SRO budget, but this is one perspective about the SRO program. There's other areas that you all may wish to explore, and that is the recommendation that we have for you to discuss elements that you'd like to potentially further explore, as well as ask any questions of Sergeant Kearns while he's here, or Captain Canfield, or myself if it's about process. But then we also recommend that you all form a 3-member subcommittee to lead any efforts and to lead this exploration, as we won't be able to make much progress if we're going to only discuss these items at these meetings. A subcommittee that is not consist of a quorum, 3 members or less, would be able to meet offline along with staff support to further discuss this. So we ask you all to let us know any questions that you may have, as well as discuss things you'd like to further explore, and to form a subcommittee. And with that concludes our presentation. And I will ask Sergeant Kern to stop sharing his screen, and we'll pass it back to Chair IR.
Thank you, Mr. Gaines, Sergeant Kearns. We appreciate this presentation. I would like to now open it up to PSAB members for any questions for either Mr. Gaines or Sergeant Kearns. Member Wang, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your presentation, Sergeant Kearns. I have a few questions. I'm just going to say them now and that you can answer in order. So could you tell us more about the selection process for SROs and kind of what qualifications they need to have, and who's chosen, as well as you mentioned that you kind of in the beginning of the day, you go through the calls that happen during the night, including mental health calls. So I'm wondering what you guys do to follow up on these calls, or if you do at all. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'll start with the last question about the mental health call. So we work very close with the staff there, the student services coordinator, as well as CHAC members. And what we've been doing in the year of the COVID is when we get these calls, so staff cannot go, they don't have the capacity, or is it in their job description to go do home visits. And so anytime a kid has an issue at school, whether it's because of a criminal nature, or if it's health reasons or mental health, They get the help through Uplift, and then we do follow-up with those kids. Now, we're not clinicians, but we let clinicians do clinician work. But if it's a kid that I know, or even if I don't know, then I'm going to show up and I'm going to give any kind of support that I can to that kid. And sometimes it's just showing up saying, hey, buddy, I'm here. What can we do for you? And sometimes it's just talking, and sometimes it's nothing today, Officer Kearns. I'm on my medicine, I'm taking my medicine, I'm going to my appointments, and everything is fine. And then I might show up another week later to find out, hey, how are you doing? So these are what we call like welfare checks, pretty much. About your first question, the selection process. The selection process is an announcement comes out from the chief when there's an opening in this unit. And you go through a board. You have to interview. Once you interview, then you're either selected or not selected to move on to the chief. Ultimately, the police chief makes all decisions when it comes to collateral positions, specialty positions, and promotions. Now, the captain and the sergeants and the lieutenants have some say about what happens there, but it all goes down to the chief. The chief makes those decisions. So the other question was, what do you have to do to get this position? Well, you got to like kids. You got to be a mentor. You've got to show that you have the capacity to deal with a child, that you have a wanting to do this job, because it's very different from any other position in the police department, whether it be a detective, whether it be a motor officer, or even a supervisor. These type of jobs, you have to have the capacity to get down and speak with kids and understand kids and have the patience to deal with the kid. So if you can't exhibit those type of abilities, you're not going to be chosen. There's been times where it's opened up and there hasn't been an officer chosen because the chief and the staff and the captain and the lieutenants don't feel that that officer has what it takes to do that job. It's that important to put the right person in the right job, especially when it comes to an SRO. I think there was a third question there, Member Wang? Did I answer all your questions? I'm sorry.
No, there wasn't a third question, but when you were talking, I just kind of thought of something. So do you do, just in terms of the mental health follow-up, like house call welfare checks, do you do those in addition to Uplift, or does Uplift only immediately respond and then you guys do the follow-up after?
So Uplift is the clinicians. They're the ones that go out and determine if the kid needs to be put on a hold, if they needs to go see a doctor or anything like that. We are separate from Uplift. So once we get the call, because a report is generated, and so that report goes to the YSU unit as a FYI. By the way, this person was contacted. So then we as a unit talk about the kid. Do we know the kid? Do we know about any issues with the kid? Yes or no? And then we as a team will go out and visit the kid to say, hey, and visit the parents. What can we do? We're your school resource officers. We understand this has happened. Again, we're not clinicians, but we're just people who are concerned because this is a child and they're obviously going through some things. So we are not part of Uplift. Uplift responds, they do their thing. The child may or may not be placed on a hold. Once the child is released back home, that's when we do our follow-up.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Member Tang, please go ahead. Member Tang, I believe you're on mute.
Dang it. Thank you. Thank you, Chair IR. Thank you, Sergeant Kearns, for your extensive presentation. I had a couple questions for you. The first one being, who provides SRO training and what does that training for SROs consist of?
Okay, so every SRO, once you select it, you have to go through a 2-week SRO school. Those SRO schools are put on by other professionals in the industry. I went to San Francisco, and it was put on by the San Francisco Police Department. And that was a long time ago. And so it just depends on what type of training we do. We also have to go, because we teach DARE, we have to go to a 2-week DARE training school to learn how to teach kids and how to run a classroom and how kids learn and how they respond. And then there's the on-the-job training. So like I mentioned, Bill Crawford, he mentored me into my position. And Bill Crawford, I don't know if I mentioned this, but Bill Crawford was an SRO for 24 years. 24 years, that's what he did. And so there's nothing like homegrown, house-grown mentoring to get officers up to speed about what the expectation is and what the history is for that department. And most importantly, what the expectation is when you take on a role as an SRO.
Thank you. My second question is, I think we may have a different understanding of this term, and what is your understanding of the school to prison pipeline?
So I'll be honest with you, Member Tang, that's a foreign concept to me. I only heard about that when one of my admin mentioned it because they heard it in a cohort. So from my understanding is school resource officers are on campuses and they're arresting kids, and those kids are ending up in the juvenile probation system. And from the juvenile probation system, they are not giving the resources they need to rehabilitate themselves. And so from there, it's just a revolving door to the point where they become adults. They're not getting the resources they need. And so they go from school to prison, and that's facilitated, so I understand, because officers are on campus and they're arresting kids. That's my understanding what this school to prison pipeline is. And again, it was a foreign concept to me because that is just not what we do. We, as the stats show you, I think there were 6 arrests in 3 years. So that's what I understand it to be. I don't know, somebody else might have a better definition of it, but again, it's a new concept to me because I just never heard of it, not in Mountain View.
Well, I guess just to clarify the term for yourself, working with children, and from somebody who has a career working with children as well, the school to prison pipeline is not just involving police officers, it's all of the adults in a child system, and how the exclusion of children in a classroom, whether they're excluded because they were, goofing off, they're talking a little too loud, things like that. It starts preparing them for being in prison because they're purposely being excluded from, society, aka the classroom. So just to impart some knowledge as well.
I appreciate that. That's more than I knew before you told me. So thank you.
Member Brodowski, please go ahead.
Hello.
Lloyd, you can just call me
thank you,
Lloyd.
Officer Kearns. Hello, Lloyd. My question is, you mentioned that we could go and watch you for this 2-week of on-campus mentoring. Mm-hmm. And you said June 28th for the next 2 weeks from 8:30 to 4 o'clock, but you didn't say where we could go.
I'm sorry. It's held at the Mountain View High School campus.
Okay.
Now, when you show up there, you got to be careful because it's under construction, but any staff person will be able to direct you to where our camp is.
Sergeant Kearns, maybe we could.
Can you give me an address?
The address? Sorry, go ahead, Mike. Go ahead, Mike.
Member Brodowski, perhaps we can determine offline or now who would like to attend, and then we can communicate a method and a schedule offline to figure out what works best for everyone. But that's
Perfect.
something
Thank you.
I can facilitate for everyone that would like to attend.
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Vice Chair Frink, you have your hand up.
Yes, ma'am. So Lloyd, I'm not sure if you remember, we've had a couple of interactions through the years. I wanted to sort of pass on that in my experience in Florida, the officers there wear khakis and polos to work in the schools. And I think it's generally well received in that community. I would just offer one concern that in Orlando, I think they have like 743 sworn officers. I think our number of sworn officers here is significantly lower. And so I just would hope that you guys also consider the safety issues associated with 3 or 4 members of the day's team not being fully geared up. I know that you guys can think about that, but that would just be my one concern to consider with that decision in our community. And I agree that the younger kids seem to really like the uniforms, at least in my experience. And it's the older kids that are a little less enthused by the uniform. And then a couple of things. I wanted to sort of make sure that you clarify that your day doesn't actually end at 5 p.m. all the time, because I have personally had occasion to reach out to an SRO to do a welfare check on a child that I was associated with after hours, and that officer was Officer Rowe, and she brought her little self right back to town and visited that child that night. And that is a thing that you guys do, and sometimes it's maybe not necessarily all that often, but it is an important feature of the work that you guys are able to do, because those kids felt like somebody was there for them, even though they may not always need something when you guys get there. And another thing I'd like to mention is through the MVPDX program, you guys talked about, the Santa Clara DA talked about how your relationship with that office is often where the diversion comes for the child who's found themselves in a little bit of trouble. And this is key because some of the kids who get into trouble, they don't have families who can afford lawyers. They don't have families who can afford all of the things associated with defending themselves from a crime. And if you guys are able to sort of do some kind of intervention because of your relationship with the DA's office, that's not a skill that a lot of other teams would have. It's not a relationship that a lot of other teams would have. And I think it's a really important part of the benefits that the SRO program offers to kids that are able to be saved from just, sometimes getting into trouble through difficult circumstances. And a lot of those difficult circumstances are things that you guys have a lot of insight in, which is the influences of gangs and other criminal elements that these kids who are, who are already struggling because their parents are just busy working, or they come in from single parent families, or they're having socioeconomic struggles. Those are influences that are very real to those kids, and having mentors such as yourselves through the PAL program and the other programs, those all happen to be part of what makes the program so successful just in this city. And I wondered if you could comment on a couple of those things. Thanks.
Absolutely. Our relationship with the DA's office is paramount to diversion. So I didn't get to talk about what happens when we go onto a school campus. Let's say a kid brings a knife onto campus. Let's say they went camping the weekend, and because they took a knife with them and they're doing camping stuff, and then that knife ended up, true story by the way, that knife ended up in the backpack and it showed up at school. School has a no tolerance, 0 weapons, gangs, violence, no tolerance. Call the police. expelled or expulsion, depending on if it was a weapon or not. We don't get involved in school decisions. That's a school decision. But the school does ask for our opinion in the matter. So what happens in that situation is we'll show up, we'll bring the kid in, we'll talk to the kid. We'll bring the parents in, we'll talk to the parent, we'll talk to the administrator. We do a powwow. What is the best outcome for this kid? What is the diversion that we need to do here? Because we don't want to put this kid in juvenile hall. He made a mistake. He bought a knife, those little Swiss knives to school, but it's a weapon. So do we cite this kid up and the DA's office says, no. Let's deal with this at the home because they don't want to see kids in jail. So it's a collaborative effort between them, between us, between the school and to the parents. And we're all an integral part of that. Very, very important. To speak to the uniforms, we will have our equipment with us. That's not changing. There will be equipment. The question is, can the kids see the equipment? They won't see it. It's there. But unless they're really looking, they won't see it because it's, we have our vests on, we have our weapons, we have handcuffs, we have radios. It's just not in their face. So that if they want to walk up to me and say, hey, Officer Kearns, hey, what's going on? Hey, no, let's go get some lunch, right? And that barrier is just gone. And this is experimental. We don't have all the answers. We don't know, but we're going to try it and see what happens. So Vice Chair Frank, I really appreciate your comments because it's folks like yourself that who can look at both sides of this thing and have a conversation. And that's what we want to do. We want to have a conversation. We are not perfect, but we're willing to do whatever it takes to serve our kids, including getting rid of that uniform and having these forums and having these conversations with kids about how can we serve you better? Because that's our calling. That's what we do. We serve kids.
Thank you. Member Langton, please go ahead.
Yeah, am I on mute? Oh, so can I make a comment, or should this be in support of this program, or should we do that in a subcommittee? Basically, I'm a beneficiary of a juvenile diversion program, and it's nice to hear that you're working with the prosecution or the district attorney's office to try and prevent a person's record from following them, the rest of their lives, and I when I was 18 and I was in high school, I saved all my money as a kid and I bought a fast car and, got into trouble. And I'm a firm believer, if I didn't get into a juvenile diversion program, I wouldn't be as successful as I am today. I think we all live on a timeline that at any one point we can kind of diverge and go in a very drastically different place. And everything that you're talking about says that you're affecting that timeline for a lot of children. I hope I'm not a base in just making a general comment as opposed to asking you a question.
That's fine. Thank you, Member Langton. Member Sandhu, thanks for your patience. Please go ahead.
Oh, absolutely no worries. Thank you very much. A couple of things I want to say, to follow up on Member Langton's, what he just said. It really helped working with the kids in the middle school and Mount View High School and Graham Middle School as a coach, soccer coach, where I was able to make sure that kids were focused. And then when we needed help, we had the support of the SROs to keep the kids in line. And not once did we have a problem. We had a couple of rumblings, but that was all taken care of. So now I've got a couple of questions here. There were 4, but thank you, Member Brodowski, for asking where it's going to be held. That's good. Now, during the pandemic, how did you work with the kids who had problems? That's the first question. If you can answer that, then I can lead to the second and the third. Thank you.
Absolutely. Like I mentioned earlier in my report, staff don't have the capacity to go deal with kids. So during the pandemic, we're twofold. We were used by the school to go and welfare check kids that didn't log on, or there was a situation where a kid got pulled off of a chair or fell off of a chair during a class, and the teacher was like, "Oh my gosh, is that violence?" Oh, and it went to a CPS report. CPS came to the police department. So we went over there and we talked to the parents. And, you know, it takes an SRO to do that, because I tell you what, if the police came to my house because my kid fell off a chair and was accusing me of being, no, that wasn't happening. So it takes a special person to be able to go in and navigate through that. Hey man, what's going on? Can I speak to little Susan? And we sit down, we talk to little Susan. Hey, what happened? Did you? Oh yeah, I was playing and my brother pulled me. The camera didn't see the brother pull her off the chair. So these are the kind of things that during a pandemic that the school used us for. Now, as far as our programs, we went digital like everyone else. We continued our mentoring program. We did it over Zoom. We met with our kids every Wednesday. We did games. We played Hangman. We played Cahoots. We tried to stay in the theme of the month. So whether it was Mother's Day or Father's Day or things like that, that's happening now. But like Valentine's Day, we do things around Valentine's Day. And so between those things, we were still able to stay connected. And then of course, our home visits. We go to home visits all the time, sometimes as directed by the staff or just because we want to check on so-and-so.
All right, my next question, Sergeant Kearns, is the Explorer program. Are there any requirements the kids need to fulfill to qualify for these programs?
So they have to show up at least 3 meetings. Once they show up at the 3rd meeting, then they get an interview from the staff, the Explorer staff. If they pass that interview, there is a background check because every person that has access to the police department has to be background. Once they finish that background check, they can become a member of the post. And they just have to be between a certain age, 14 and 21. You should live in the city of Mountain View, but we have made some exceptions for that. You don't necessarily have to be in the city of Mountain View. And you have to go, at some point, you have to go to a Explorer Academy. That is 8 weeks on the weekend. It's usually in the fall. Once you do those things, you're sworn in, and you're good to go.
My next question is, does the YSU work with CHECK? I know you work with Uplift. CHECK is a very reliable source, a fantastic resource we have in this community. We are thankful to have it here. So do you work with them a lot? Absolutely.
Now, of course, what they talk about with their students is confidential. So unless it's something that is in violation of the law that we need to be brought into, and that happens a lot, absolutely. We know all the clinicians at Mountain View High School, very good friends of ours. And so we 100% rely on chat, because what we'll do when we come in and have a kid is the first thing we're saying, hey, have you talked to CHAC? Depending on what the issue is. Well, no, okay, let's talk to your parents. Let's talk about CHAC. Let's get you into CHAC and let's see if we can work it out there. So we're an advocate for them and they're an advocate for us.
And lastly, just a final comment. I'm really hopeful that the Pell soccer will be back. I know why it was shut down a few years ago. It was really, really unfortunate. And this segment of the society, residents of Mountain View, they could really use that. And thank you very much.
And Pal basketball.
Oh, yes.
Mr. Gaines, did you have a question?
Yes, I did. Just a comment, actually. I just wanted to just check in and see where you are. I know this meeting is scheduled to be until 9 p.m. and we still haven't opened public comment, and we'd still like you all to consider staff's recommendations. So it's completely up to you, but I just wanted to check in and ask where you are with that.
Okay, thank you for that. I think if we could wrap up within the next half an hour, I'd like to do that. Is there any members of the board who have a hard stop or need to go or anything? I don't want to drag it on too long because I do want to take on the recommendations, but is that 30 minutes sound reasonable? Okay, with that, Member Wang, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Just a final question. So as a school resource officer, and you've talked about your experience, what do you think SROs and YSU could do to be better? Like what improvements do you think could be made as an SRO yourself, and what do you need to do whatever you're doing better?
That's a great question, Member Wang. Some of the things personally, even when I was an SRO back in 2002, I've always thought the uniform was a barrier. It was very hard for me to break those barriers with kids because of personal issues, personal experiences. I just couldn't get past. And I'm pretty cool, right? I come across, hey guys, let's hang, let's go play basketball, let's do what we do. But it's like, yeah. The uniform. So I think I have to applaud my administration in recognizing that and hearing what we have to say about that and hearing what the cohorts have to say about uniforms on the school. Because just because you change the uniform, you don't change the person in the uniform, right? If the uniform is a barrier, but the person in the uniform is successful in what he does, you don't want to remove the person, remove the barrier. That's the uniform. So let's start with that. We'll do that first. The other thing that I do believe that we are lacking tremendously in our program is what we do at the high school. High school is a different animal. Young adults, they speak their mind, they know what they want to do, at least some of them. And it's hard to crack that through that. And so some of the things that we are going to be doing is starting a club. We want to start a club on the campus, just like your chess clubs and your science clubs. We're going to have a Mountain View SRO club, or we don't know what we're going to call it yet. But the idea is to bring officers to the campus, uniform and not, bring in our experiences, bring in some of the things that we do, maybe bring a K-9 in for demonstration, maybe have a SWAT member come in and talk about what they do, just to kind of open up what we do as police officers. The other thing we thought about doing is we absolutely need the students to understand who we are, what we represent, and why we're on the campus. We haven't done a good job of that. But we're working on that too. We're going to be in announcements, at least we're going to try. We're going to showing up at assemblies and doing talks and just doing face-to-faces. Hey, we're here. We have an office here. This is our office. What you tell us is confidential. Come and see us if you have issues. So it's really just being available. And that's the start. But we're open to any and all ideas.
Thank you.
So I have some questions and comments, but like I did last time, I'm going to hold until after public comment if there are no more PSAB questions at this time. Okay, so with that, I will open up to public comment. Let me go and check how many folks have their hands raised. Give me a second. It looks like we have 4 people with their hands raised. So in the interest of time, Mr. Gaines, I'd like to keep the comments to 2 minutes, please. First hand raised that I see is Miriam C. Please go ahead.
Hi. One thing I'd like to know more about as a community member is what the success metrics are for the program. So if what are the explicitly stated goals? The SRO program exists to do X, and then how do you measure success against those goals? Because I think while anecdotal evidence is always important, I was the one talking about data geeks earlier, so I always like to see data. So I think that would be really helpful. Thanks.
Dave Lutger, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Please go ahead.
That's exactly correct. Thank you. So I think with only 2 minutes, I have kind of a few just concerns I heard, and I think as I'm saying this, maybe just frame them as things I'd definitely like to either hear about now or explore, or for the PSAB to explore further. I think, I don't know, in situations like this, I think who gets to speak first has huge impacts on the decisions that are made later. It's the second meeting of the PSAB and the first one that isn't kind of like a general introduction. So I definitely felt in this case like this presentation was pretty much PR for the SRO program, kind of to seemingly just soften up this board before engaging critically with any issues concerning SROs. And I believe Sergeant Kearns believes in his mission. I believe you love what you do. I'm sure Bill Crawford was great. I think me and other members of the public are really concerned about the outcomes today. I want to remind the board about, the council meeting in which dozens of students shared their trauma interacting with SROs. I'm a little bit curious why we're kind of centering the SROs today and not the public whose safety we're concerned for. I don't really want to, re-traumatize those students, but, will we be hearing any day in the life presentations about the life of a student interacting with an SRO? I do have major concerns about the uniforms. It sounds like we're acknowledging that there are issues, but we're addressing a symptom and not the cause. As expressed, changing the clothes does not necessarily change the function of the officer. And I actually kind of think concealing the equipment is potentially more harmful and kind of seems like a trick. I think students deserve to know if SROs are armed or have stuff. I also don't know if the equipment in this case actually includes weapons. That would be a good thing to know. So if we can answer that, that'd be great. And I also just don't see why a lot of these functions need to be fulfilled by police officers. Boxing, sports, any team building. I think if the mission is mentoring, then be a mentor. I don't necessarily think a resource police officer needs to be the one doing that. So, yeah, a couple of things I'm concerned about there. I think also, the idea that if I oversleep and miss virtual school and then a cop comes to my house, also pretty concerning.
Okay. I think you may have reached your time limit, Mr. Lutgar. Thank you for your comments. I would like to call on Salim Demirci. Please go ahead.
Hi, yeah, I'm Salim. I'm on the steering committee for Los Altos for Racial Equity. Yeah, I think there are two important things to consider when you're considering the SRO program. One, there are the programs that the SRO spends most of their time working on. And then two, there's the question of who should run the programs. I actually tend to think that the programs are fine programs. Like they make a lot of sense. Like this welfare checks program makes sense. At a prior school board meeting, I heard the SRO tell a story about a time when parents sent him to ask their daughter why her grades were slipping. They weren't sure if it was a boyfriend or what. Sergeant Kearns learned that it was procrastination in social media. And I think it's great that someone checked up on that daughter to make sure that, she could get, her act together academically. I just don't think an armed cop should be showing up to bother a teenager about why her grades are slipping. It seems like the SRO program in a nutshell is that we have a vacuum where teaching should be, and we're filling it with policing. Teachers and behavioral health experts get years of training to do this sort of stuff. And we heard that there are a few weeks of training for an SRO. I think that's a really important consideration you should take into account. Separate the programs from who should do the programs, because there's a real question about who's the most qualified to do these programs. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Mr. McKenzie, welcome back. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Officer Kearns, for sharing your story. It was really compelling. I was particularly struck by your calling to deal with children, and then you had to go be a law enforcement agent to be able to do that. Isn't it sad that we as a society have structured and chosen not to fund the pathways through which you could work with children and not in a law enforcement capacity? I want to echo the people who spoke earlier. The programs, the individuals may be great, but why is it armed agents of the state tasked with enforcing laws? The job of the police department is narrow. It's the armed agents of the state tasked with enforcing laws and keeping the peace. But police have been now asked to take on a lot of different roles. And we should be a few weeks of training that can't match up for years and years of training, as was just mentioned. And I also want to echo what was said earlier about right now we're centering the SROs, but this is the Public Safety Advisory Board. We should be centering public. When the kids spoke a few months ago at City Council, they're much more engaged than I ever was at that age, and it was really striking. Like one person mentioned being late for class because they would take the long way around anytime they saw an SRO. Also, I would like to, as a member of the public, see the memoranda of understanding between the school districts and MVPD. I'm from the Montaloma community, and we're worrying about whether or not we'll lose access to our park because what we thought was a park is really the school district. And a lot of these things can be a little bit confusing, and I think it would be very useful and important for that to be out in the public, and so that we can understand. Thank you.
Okay, I believe that's all the public comment that we have. Mr. Lutger, Mr. Demergy, your hands are still up, but since you've had your 2 minutes, I'm assuming that's a remnant from before. So I'd like it to open it up to PSAB members for additional comments, questions. Vice Chair Frink, I see your hand up.
Yes, ma'am. As a Black man who was raised in a Black community, specifically a redlined Black community, the question about why does it have to be a cop is one that is particularly insensitive and frustrating to me. The reason why it has to be a cop is because they stepped up. And that's the simple fact of it. Cities don't provide services for kids who need these services. That's the simple fact. I coach youth basketball. Sal coaches youth sports. We see a lot of kids in these programs who have needs that are not being met. And the people who step up to do that happen to be police officers. And they happen to be police officers because they're also serving other duties. They're trying to keep these kids out of the juvenile justice system. They're trying to keep these kids away from gangs. They're trying to keep these kids away from other influences that might be problematic for them. If somebody wants to come up with a program that does all these things and will do welfare checks at 9 o'clock at night and will run youth programs and sports programs and mentor these kids and teach them things that their families can't teach them because they're so busy trying to pay the rent, cool with it, let's go. But it doesn't exist today. And so this is what we have. These are the people who stepped up and they work really hard at it. And I'm happy to be a part of finding other resources so that we can figure that out. If we want to have other resources, let's go. Let's go. Because the cops would be happy to just, solve crimes all day. They love that. But we're not giving them that opportunity. We're asking them to do these other things. We're asking them to respond to mental health calls. We're asking them to respond to truancy calls. We're asking them to respond to all these other things. And then we're mad that they're doing it. And that for me is a particular source of frustration.
Thank you, Vice Chair Frink. Member Tang, please go ahead.
With all due respect, that is the exact question that we're asking, is why does this funding have to come from the police department? And it easily could come from the city instead of the police department. And that is what happened. The police stepped up. But at the same time, we are looking at these other services that don't have to come from the police. I work at a high school in East Palo Alto, and we did all these things. We did welfare checks. We provide counseling. We provide after-school activities. We provide all of those programs that you were asking about, and we don't need the police in order to do that. And why can't we do that here in Mountain View, where we are so well funded, is my question here. And I think that you have great, valid questions. Those are all the questions that I am asking as well. Thank you.
Member Langton, please go ahead.
I kind of agree with Eva. There's always potential for solving things in a different way. But I do think the position that Mountain View Police Department plays in its diversion aspect of trying to get kids away from the law before they get too far into the system is a role that a civilian person can't play. So as much as they might find, a replacement option for the school resource officer, they're always going to need some role, in my opinion, in trying to divert youth from, the prison to pipeline, school to prison pipeline kind of thing.
Vice Chair Frink, additional comments? Vice Chair Frink, you're on mute.
I'm sorry, I think it was just left up. I just would say, sure, I work with a lot of those kids in East Palo Alto. They play in my club and have for the last 8 years. So I know a fair number of them. And I believe that they're good kids and they work hard. We keep them in the basketball gym. That's our solution. So there are other options. But again, as I mentioned earlier, when a kid does make a bad choice and they get into trouble and they get into the system, you need somebody who has a relationship with the DA's office or somebody from the DA's office to deal with those issues. And that can't be a teacher. That can't necessarily be a civilian, as Mr. Langton said. It has to be an officer. And that's why it's good for these folks to work with these kids, because they have this particular set of needs. And whereas other wealthier kids might have a family attorney who can do that work for them, these kids don't have those resources. And so it's a resource. I see it as a resource for this particular group of kids. And if we're going to remove the resource from this group, as long as we have something to back it up that does the same thing, it's great. I'm fine with that. But we just can't take away things before we do that.
Thank you. Mr. Gaines, would you put up the two recommendations that staff had for PSAP, or Sergeant Kearns? I'm not sure who has control. I'd like to talk about those two things. My comments will primarily be about the first one, and then I want to open it up. Okay. So can everyone see this? The first recommendation is discuss SRO program elements to potentially further explore. So you all will get to know me a little better and know that I make lists. So this is my list right now. I'd like to encourage you all to add to this as you see fit. So again, I want to thank Sergeant Kearns for your passion and your dedication and for your service. You've clearly made a difference in the life of many kids over your tenure. And Mr. Gaines for helping bring all of this to our attention. These are my questions that don't need to be answered right now, but either could be at a future session or might be something that is then picked up by the subcommittee, which is recommendation 2, should we decide to go with that idea. Okay, so let's do these things. I'd like to understand a little more information on the arrests, even though they were minimal, that were made, the demographics of those arrests, the demographics of the kids that the SROs in Mountain View serve, both the SROs directly and the programs. I was a little concerned, Sergeant Kearns, when you talked about the school called you because they were concerned there might be some gang activity and they wanted your presence. How do you ensure? So this, again, this could be a follow-up. How many calls come from schools where that's initiating your presence on campus versus you're thinking, I'm going to go check in at Mountain View High today? I'd like to understand when the school calls you, and how do you deal when schools aren't really stepping up to what they can do? I think there was a couple of comments about what is really needed for police officers to handle, and when are educators kind of expecting you to do more when really they should be stepping up more. I'd like to understand that more, and maybe some data behind that. How many calls are initiated by schools? What is the content of those calls? And when have you had to push back and say, no, don't call me for that, right? You need to step up as an educator, as an administrator, and take care of that yourself. So I'd like more information about that. I would like to encourage the youth services team at Mountain View PD. Before you go forward with the outfit, before you start an SRO club, before you decide to before you draft up how you want to communicate more broadly what it is that you do and the services you provide, talk to us, talk to students, talk to the community, ensure those that you are serving are agreeing with the ways you're approaching those things, right? Have Member Wang can help with this. Have a few students check out your polo and your khaki outfit. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Should the belt be outside? What are you carrying? I'd like to know that too. Is it a reduced set of weapons is proposed, or tools, I should say, or the whole thing? I'd love Member Wang to say, you know what, that's not going to fly, or change the color or whatever. This isn't the fashion parade, obviously, but I'd love for the team to get feedback before you push something out. Same with the SRO club, and same with the communication, the idea of communications going more broadly. Please ask those who you are going to be served what they think of your ideas. And we'd love to hear them too. I would like to understand, and I believe a public comment was towards this end, how does a program, and Captain Canfield, this was maybe a more broader question for MVPD, how are programs measured in terms of effectiveness? How are they evaluated? How are police officers performance rated? How do you know if they're, ready for promotion, ready for more money, ready for a higher rank? Is it just an exam? What happens yearly, annually? And specifically in this context, it's for SROs, but I'd like to understand more broadly for MVPD. I'd like to understand how, and this may be a subcommittee question, but I'd like to understand how members of PSAB might be able to meet members of the school community, whether it's students or parents, casually. I don't need students to come to this meeting and talk in public, right? Maybe it's just a coffee or an ice cream, whatever kids are having, boba, whatever kids are having these days. Can we meet some folks casually, not as a group, maybe one-on-one, just so we can have that experience? I'd also like to request MVPD to advise, and Sergeant Kearns specifically, have you seen the testimonials, specifically the student testimonials on the Justice Vanguard site, which are from MVPD? We're not worried about Los Altos High right here in this context. I'd love to understand your thoughts on those two testimonials and get your perspective. We certainly have the students' perspectives. I'd love to hear your perspective because they had some issues, and we'd love to understand whether it was you who was involved or one of the other officers. What's your perspective on it? And then, is the MOU public? I don't know the answer to that. Does anyone on this call know whether the MOU is public? Can Mr. McKenzie see it? Can the rest of us see it?
Yes, it's public. And if you can't find it through searching, then one of us staff members can find it for you.
Okay, Mr. McKenzie, please drop an email to Mr. Gaines and sort that out. Okay, I think that's everything I have in terms of follow-up items. I'd like to invite other members of PSAB to add to that in terms of other elements to explore at this time. And Sergeant Kearns, thanks for your patience. I hope you had enough paper and pen for that. It was a long list, I know. I'm curious now. Let me open this up. Vice Chair Frank, your hand was up first. Please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. We talked earlier about just some of the success stories from previous years, and there's a lot of kids who have come through the program who have moved on to other parts of life, both positive and negative. So I think it's a good idea to present some, even if it's just anecdotal, some idea of how the kids have fared coming through the programs and how the diversions have protected them, as well as some of the kids who it didn't help. I think that's useful information.
Thank you. Member Tang?
I'm one of these self-proclaimed data nerds in Mountain View. So I would really love to see success metrics as mentioned before. I mean, I guess this is hard to do, but like my usual go-to is like a pre-survey and then a post-survey, but I'm not sure how easy that is for you as the YSU officer to do. But I mean, you know, a definition of goals of the programs and the definition of your purpose for being on campus, as well as is that purpose and is that goal being met? And those metrics would go along with that. And that's what I would like to see. Thank you.
Well, I know Member Wang had mentioned at our last meeting that there are surveys done at the end of the year. We weren't able to do that this time. It was just too short a turnaround. Member Wang, I see your hand up, so maybe you have more to say on it.
Yes, there are surveys done every year, and they're not just at the end of the year. So if we do want to do that, they have them at the beginning of the year and just all the time. So I think hearing other student opinions would also be very valuable. I'm also interested in learning more about kind of the more definite distribution of roles between mental health services like Uplift and the SROs and the DAs. I think it's called the Community Prosecution Unit. I know the name was really weird. So kind of the distribution of roles between that and how they figure out like, where do you draw the line and where is it definitely one person's job rather than another's.
Member Sandhu, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Just like we're going to ask, get students' feedback, it'd be great to have the parents because they are an integral part of this equation. So it'd be good to get some feedback as the interaction they had with SRO officers. I think that's key. Thank you.
Vice Chair Frank?
Yes, ma'am. I just also wanted to acknowledge that the schools in East Palo Alto, almost all of them, have some really good programs, and maybe we should hear about some of those. What are those schools? What are those teachers? What are those programs doing to help reduce the need of or the involvement of SROs? Well, I had one other thing, but maybe I'll come back to it another time. But yeah, and I know Eva is eager to share that information. So.
Okay, Member Wang?
Yes, Member Sandy, sorry, just speaking to kind of parents. I noticed that in one of the readings that was in the agenda that we read before the meeting, there was feedback about police programs, including SROs, and all of that feedback about SROs, I think they said in the report, was by parents. And while I think it is important to include the opinions of parents, I think definitely valuing the opinions of students is important, just because like, as a teenager, I think there is definitely a difference in thought and opinion and experience.
Okay, I'm checking to see if I see any other hands up in terms of item number 1, discuss SRO program elements to potentially further explore. Okay. All right. So the second, I guess we did your recommendation, Mr. Gaines. Were we supposed to check and see if we wanted to do that? Sorry, it just jumped right in. The second recommendation from staff is to form a 3-member subcommittee to lead efforts. I tend to agree with Mr. Gaines that this is an important topic. And I think given our timeline, it makes sense to have a 3-member subcommittee to maybe meet more often, do outreach, speak to folks, understand some of the answers to these questions that we've posed, and come back perhaps with some preliminary recommendations of how the program might evolve in Mountain View. So I tend to agree with that. I wanted to stop there and see what other people thought about having a subcommittee. Vice Chair Frink?
Yeah, just on the one more note on the last part of this, which is that apparently we can request some insight from the school district regarding the feedback that they're getting from the students through official channels. I just wanted to make sure you're aware of that.
Thank you. Okay. Member Langton?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if we move forward on the subcommittee, I think it would make sense to try and make it, like, I think I'm already have a bias of a little bit pro SRO. So I think we would want to balance the committee out with, you know, somebody that might be leaning more in the opposition. I think it would make sense to just take some care in how we select those people.
Okay, thank you. Member Sandhu?
I like the idea. I think it's a good idea too, because you're right with the limited timeline we have. We need to get on this, and to form a 3-person team would be fantastic. And I would be happy to jump in there if you need me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let me see if any other hands. Vice Chair Frink, do you have an additional comment?
Yeah, is there a reason that it has to be 3? Can it be 4?
I believe Brown Act comes into play.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. That's right. I understand now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. I have some thoughts about who might be on this subcommittee. So I'm just going to voice them and we can talk. I agree with Member Langton that, you know, we definitely want diverse opinions. And as I look at this committee, I really appreciate all of you for the opinions you bring. For this particular subcommittee, what strikes me as it might be an interesting team is Member Tang as a school teacher and as a member of MVCPRA. And I think that's a very interesting and important perspective to bring to this. I would also think about Member Wang as a student, the only current high school student on this board. I think that your perspective is really, really incredibly important. So I would think that. And the third member I'm musing about is Member Brodowski for her links to the local Latinx community. So to me, these 3 would be an amazing subcommittee, but I am open to feedback right now on my suggestions. Vice Chair Frink?
I'm okay with that. I definitely feel that Member Tang should be involved, just for balance. I'm good with Brodowski as well. My musing comes from Wang because I also very much like the leadership of Cal, and I think both of them have some great experiences to share. That would be my
Thank you.
interest.
Member Langton?
So yeah, I somewhat agree with Cleve. I definitely like Joan. I think she's a very neutral arbiter. And I know, I don't know. Yeah, it's just my pre. And yeah, I'm on the fence of both Eva and having like two people with a school background. Like, would you maybe have like a student and maybe one other person? I don't know. That's just my musing, I guess. Is it seems very weighted, kind of. Even Joan, I think, has an educational background. It's very heavily weighted to like people with. No, okay, maybe I was wrong on that. So I don't know. I'm not completely opposed to it. I just think maybe one of the three, it might do well to have, I don't know, some other diversity component to it. But that's my, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can use my powers and appoint this council, but I'd like to have everyone invested in this. We should probably hear from the people that I just sort of nominated. Member Wang, please go ahead.
Thank you. So just in terms of, having people with backgrounds in education and in schools, I actually think that might be the most important thing, especially since we are talking about school resource officers. So that affects students, that affects teachers, and that does affect the rest of the community as well, but mainly the people who are there every day, who are the students and the teachers. So I do think it is very important to have a student perspective, and that's what people are calling for students to have, the type of support they need, whether that be with SROs or not, to get the best education they possibly could have. And I think since we're sharing our perspectives on SROs, I do have my opinions on both keeping SROs and, potentially coming up with alternative solutions, but I'm not dead set either way. So I am open for conversation, and I do really want to find the best solution for students and for students' communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Wang. That almost sounded like a stump speech. Appreciate that. Member Brodowski? You may be on mute. Oh, there you go.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. I think both Eva and Jeanette are obvious choices. They have to be there. But then I think we need somebody more invested on the side of the police. And I would think that either Derek or Cleve would be better for that than I am.
So Joan, I was thinking of you because of of everyone on this board. You have the closest ties to the Hispanic community, whose children are probably, we don't have the information in front of us, but my guess is are most impacted by the SRO program.
Well, I read through the comments that we had on the that we had to read for tonight, and I didn't see a huge need for somebody to represent the Latino community, and I don't think that that's such an issue here. But I would prefer not to be on this.
You'd prefer not to be on this.
But if I'm drafted, I'll do it.
Well, no, I don't think we're at the point of drafting at this point. We did have a volunteer, an alternate volunteer in Member Sandhu. Is that something that you would still be interested in? Member Sandhu?
Oh, yes. Thank you. Yes, I would be interested in it because I'm trying to look at both sides of it. Yes, I did praise the SROs today, but I have been dealing with issues with students when I was coaching, and I'm still coaching, and I try to take an objective view. If nobody else wants to do it, Member Frink, Vice Chair Frink, and Mr. Langton, I'll be happy to do it.
So members Langton and Frink, what do you think of members Tang, Wang, and Sandhu?
So for me, I have a student in Mountain View High School right now, and I wouldn't want him to be involved in this. So I struggle with having someone directly associated with it being in this position, but I see the other side of it as well. I'm conflicted there. Other than that, I like Sal. I definitely like Ms. Tang being involved, and I'm amenable for the third.
Okay. Member Langton, does this ease some of your concerns?
Yeah, I like that choice. I feel it. Yeah, it presents a little more of a balanced board.
Okay.
So I'm not gonna be like, yeah, I like that. I'm happy with that.
Member Tang, are you comfortable to have been drafted for this, or not drafted, sorry, suggested?
I'm honored, thank you. I also advocate for Member Wang to be on the subcommittee, as she is closest to and is most impacted. Is most impacted and is closest to the most impacted by this program.
Member Sandhu, do you have additional comments?
Oh, sorry. I thought I had removed it. Sorry.
Okay. So with that, I would recommend then, or I don't know, Mr. Gaines, what am I supposed to say? I hereby appoint. I don't know. But I would very, very much like to have Ms. Wang, Ms. Tang, or sorry, Member Wang, Member Tang, sorry. It's late. I'm getting my titles mixed up. And Member Sandhu be the 3-member subcommittee that staff has recommended.
That is sufficient. You just appointed Member Tang, Member Sandhu, and Member Wang, and
fantastic.
That's that. Thank you.
Okay. So I would encourage the 3 of you to get with Melvin as quickly as possible, so that we could even see some baseline thoughts and recommendations at the July PSAB meeting. Okay, you don't have to solve world hunger, but directionally, we'd like to see where you're going. For everyone else's understanding of this subcommittee will come back to us before anything is ever presented to City Council. This team will have discussion, so it's not going directly from subcommittee to council, just in case anyone had questions about that. Member Langton, your hand is up.
Yeah, so I was gonna say, yeah, they're gonna kind of, get together and kind of formulate their opinion, then kind of bring it to the group, and then we'll mull it over some more.
We will mull.
That's all. Okay.
Absolutely, there will be mulling.
Sounds good.
Okay, I hope nobody feels conscripted, but I thank you in advance for your service. With that, I would like to move on to item 5. So we are now closing oral communication and moving to discussion action items. So I would like to ask, oh no, I have a script here. The next item is board staff comments, questions, and committee reports. No action will be taken on any questions raised by the PSAB at this time. Do any PSAB members or staff have comments or questions? I will add, this is the time, if you have suggestions for future agenda items, to please speak up. Member Sandhu, please go ahead.
Yes, I think we should really start working on the work plan. Hopefully with the next meeting, the year is coming to an end almost. We are past the halfway already, and I think that should be agendized next meeting or the meeting after, whatever is the most convenient. Thank you.
Yeah, I believe it will be, because our plan is to have that ready for city council by the end of August. So, okay, Member Langton?
So are you saying if I have ideas for like a work plan, or are we gonna do that at another meeting?
If you have ideas for agenda items.
Agenda item. So this isn't like a work plan. I think I can hold off till we start to discuss like a work plan.
Okay.
Like when you say agenda,
Would you like to talk about the contents of the work plan at an upcoming agenda? Or
yeah,
at
I
a
guess so.
meeting?
Yeah, I have some thoughts on things that I'd like to put into that.
To put into the work plan. Got you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Vice Chair Frink?
Yes, ma'am. I have a couple things here. I would like to discuss at some point in the future how the fire department play a role in working with mental health issues. I've brought this up with the mayor's office in the past, but these are folks who have medical training already. And is it possible to use their training to assist in this area, despite the state legislation that prevents the city from having mental health specialists embedded in our public safety departments? I would also like, I think, at some point to review and discuss bike safety in our city as kids ride their bikes to school, and how that plays out in the public safety. And I know that there's another committee that does look at this, but just how it sort of works with public safety with respect to students as well, pedestrian safety and school zones, which I think are really an important aspect of the student life in this city. And then, of course, there's already been some talk about speed limits and how they may affect public safety going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Member Brodowski?
Thank you. I do have something that's been on my mind for a while, since it was over a month ago that the Mountain View Voice reported on a suit against the city by a guy who was apparently pulled out of his car at 2:30 in the morning, if I've got my facts right. And I think that this is the sort of thing, he's essentially complaining that there was police brutality involved. And I think it's the sort of thing we should be looking at. However, I understand that we are not to look at this because there is a suit involved. And so I don't know if we can put it on the agenda. I don't know if we can. I think we should find out if we can't look at it, who says we can't and why. And I'm perfectly open to, if it's a legislative thing, of course not. But I think we ought to at least be clear why we can't discuss it if we can't. And when could we discuss this sort of thing? Because if it comes up, the same sort of thing comes up again, our wonderful Mountain View Police Department, which I adore, once in a while is going to have a problem. And I ran an office with 10 or 15 people. And with 10 or 15 people, I had problems frequently and horrible problems. So if with 100 police officers, why aren't we going to see some in Mountain View? And I think that's our job. So that is what I would like to put on the agenda, that we either discuss this or find out why we can't.
So discuss the complaints policies and use of force policies, it sounds like.
And the particular case.
And this particular case as well. Okay, thank you. Member Tang?
I wanted to second Vice Chair Frank's suggestion about, I think it was fire department and mental health. Also an exploration of Sunnyvale's decision to combine police and fire into one public safety department. And I hear rumors that Palo Alto is considering that too. A potential exploration of that for Mountain View is a suggestion.
Okay, thank you.
Interesting.
Member Sander?
Yes, I just forgot one other item. Would like to find out exactly what the diversity hiring by both the MVPD and the MVFD are. So how do they go about hiring? I know they have over the years, since when I first started in 2003 as a Human Relations Commission, from there to now, I've seen more diverse hiring, but what's the process of it? So if we can hear about that, that'd be good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Member Langton.
After hearing everybody else talk, I figure I'll just put it out there, just the content that I'm thinking that I'd like to talk about down the road. I'm specifically interested in kind of like the use of criminal records, driver history, prosecution decisions on, kind of like the juvenile diversion program of trying to like prevent people from getting a criminal record, and just how often like a person's record is influenced in a police officer making a decision to cite. So I think there's a kind of a broad issue of like how long a person's criminal record follows them down the road, and that you can't really erase that, and how it impacts a person's life, kind of moving forward. And, is there a pipeline to kind of prison and never getting a good job? And, and just, I'm just really curious. I know as a police officer, I used to use, I get a person's criminal record, they respond, he has 10 entries on his board of probation, he has 25 entries on his driver history, and that could impact my decision to cite a person. And I just think that, I'm curious on drilling down on kind of that type of content.
Great. Thank you, Member Langton. Vice Chair Frink.
Yes, ma'am. Just a couple other things. Sort of finishing off of Member Langton's question. I would also wondering what the actual fee schedule is for citations in our city, and what the motivation is behind that. This is specifically driven for me because the state has just decided to waive, past due fines and citation fees for the past year or so because of the pandemic. And it's a thing that these fees often cause people who are already struggling to really get into more trouble. And so just an understanding of how ours are sculpted and whether or not that makes any sense, and just to ask those questions. And then secondly, I wanted to just mention the Sunnyvale department, the police department and the fire department do this sort of switch thing where they actually do both. So at some point you're a fireman for some period of time, and then you move over to police department for some period of time. And it's not necessarily given that you have to do that, but they do that. They switch back and forth, I think, for some period of time. And so it's just an interesting tidbit about the department.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Gaines, I don't see any other hands up other than yours.
Thank you, Chair Iyer. I just wanted to provide a little context to you all. First, thank you all for all of these wonderful ideas of things that you would like to explore. But I just caution you that the process, and I'll preface it with this: every item that you want to explore takes time. It takes time for us to discuss the matters as a body, as a PSAB. We've discussed 2 items tonight and it's taken over 2 hours. So there's that. But then it also takes staff legwork to be able to put things together for you. So that is why we try to get you all to adopt a work plan that we're able to evaluate and tell you, like, this is what it would take for staff to do the necessary work to provide you with the information that is necessary for you to make good decisions and make good recommendations. So all of these ideas are appropriate to bring up. However, they should be brought up in a sense of, these are the things we'd like to consider for our work plan, not necessarily these are things that need to be agendized at the next meeting. So there should be, I believe, Member Sandhu recommended he wants to discuss the work plan, and Chair Iyer affirmed that, yes, the next 2 meetings we will likely have work plan discussions, but it likely will not be 20 items on that work plan. There might be 5 items, there might be 10, there might be 2 items. So I just wanted to bring that to you, and I will be asking you all to prioritize the things as a body. Like tonight, we've discussed things kind of individually, but collectively as a body, decide how you'd like to prioritize the items that you'd really like to undertake for the next year. And we will present that to the city council for them to approve in September, because the ultimate work plan approval, it comes from council deciding these are the things that we'd like you to provide input on, because these are things that we're really interested in.
Does that make sense to everybody? Thank goodness for Melvin keeping us in line. All right. So with that, are there any other comments? I'm checking for hands raised. Okay. So thank you all again for your time. I would like to request everyone to, if you can, please attend the SRO activities at Mountain View High. If you don't attend, you better have a damn good excuse. I expect all of you to go and check that out. All right. With that, we are adjourned. Have a good evening. Thank you.